on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter.
Advocates for Cuban political prisoners testified about that country's human rights record at a House hearing today. The witnesses were critical of attempts to reestablish diplomatic relations with Cuba. New Jersey Republican Chris Smith chairs the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Global Human Rights. This is 2 hours, 40 minutes.
Good morning to everyone, and welcome to this very timely and important hearing on human rights in Cuba. We are here to examine the state of human rights, which is a very timely topic indeed, given the Obama administration's sea change in policy towards Cuba announced at the end of last year. We are here to ask whether, in undertaking this change in policy, the Obama administration used the considerable leverage that it wields to seek to better the condition of the Cuban people, or whether, as I fear, as an opportunity that was squandered in its haste to achieve a diplomatic breakthrough and even create a legacy for the president. Thus, this hearing is not only about Castro regime accountability, but also the Obama administration's accountability, with Congress exercising its role of both oversight and as a bully pulpit for reminding the world that Cuba remains a communist dictatorship which continues to arrest political dissidents. And I would underscore an estimated 178 political dissidents in the last month alone, and one whose caudillo, Raul Castro, has declared would not change even in response to the Obama administration's concessions. This Castro regime continues to harbor fugitives from justice, such as Joanne Chesimard, who was convicted in the 1973 murder of a state trooper in my own home state of New Jersey. Officer Werner Forrester was gunned down gangland style after she escaped from prison. Indeed, just yesterday we had the Assistant Secretary for State for the Western Hemisphere, Roberta Jacobson, appear before the full Committee of Foreign Affairs. I asked her what the response of the Cuban government was when she raised the issue of the return of Joanne Chesimard to justice. She replied that the Cuban government stated that it was, quote, not interested in discussing her return, close quote. That is absolutely unacceptable. I have in my hands a statement which I asked to be submitted for the record from Christopher Burgos, the president of the State Troopers Fraternal Organization in New Jersey, where he states on behalf of our Jersey State Troopers that, quote, we are shocked and very disappointed that returning a convicted killer of a state trooper was not already demanded and accomplished in the context of the steps announced by the White House regarding this despotic dictatorship. I would also point out that, as an aside, that both President Burgos and New Jersey State Police Superintendent Colonel Rick Fuentes both very much wanted to be here, and we will have another hearing to hear from them, and I look forward to that follow-up hearing. But unfortunately, we do have with us, fortunately, and it is a tremendous honor and a privilege to have with us today, three extraordinarily brave and uniquely qualified witnesses to the brutality of the Cuban dictatorship. Three human rights activists who, at great personal cost to themselves and their families, have and continue to stand up for human dignity. We will hear about the deplorable state of human rights in Cuba. Just read the State Department report on human rights, as well as other reporting that has been done by other NGOs. And it couldn't be more clear that human rights are violated with impunity by the Castro brothers and their regime. I would note parenthetically that years ago, during the Reagan administration, I met with Armando Valladares, who spent almost 2 decades in the Cuban Gulag system. And I'll never forget when I went and read his book. He actually led a delegation to the United Nations UN Commission. Matter of fact, Ileana and her staff, we went time and time again to that commission, asking them to look at the deplorable state of human rights in Cuba. When I was with Armando Valladares, I was in awe of his courage as well. He was able to get the UN to look at, pass a resolution condemning the deplorable situation in Cuba, and to deploy a team to go to the prisons and investigate these terrible abuses of human rights. There were promises made by Fidel Castro that there would be no retaliation whatsoever against those who spoke in prison and the family members who came forward and friends to bear witness to a terrible truth and set of truths. Everybody was retaliated against. The people in the prisons, as well as their families. And regrettably, the UN was unable, perhaps unwilling, but certainly unable to do anything to mitigate it or to stop that retaliation. I have pushed for years to go to Cuba. I've been denied a visa for 2 decades or so. I want to go to the prisons. Of course, I'll meet with Fidel if I am able to lead a delegation or even go on my own with my staff. We can't get that visa. Both Frank Wolf and I tried a number of times, and it got so bad that at one point Fidel Castro said that we were provocateurs. I want to go meet with the dissidents. Frank Wolf and I got into prisons in the Soviet Union, the infamous Perm Camp 35, where people like Natan Sharansky suffered and were tortured by that communist dictatorship. When Shadana Guzmão, who became the president of East Timor, I went and saw him when he was in Jakarta and went to prisons all over the world. But we can't get into Cuba. We even got into Beijing prison number 2, where 40 Tiananmen Square activists were being forced to do gulag labor, head shaved, gaunt, looked like concentration camp victims. And yet, Mr. Wolf and I, could not and I can't get into those prisons. So I will be asking the government, again, have already asked, and I've asked our government to help facilitate it, to go to the prisons. And even on the ICRC yesterday, the Red Cross, I asked Secretary Jacobson, and I said, you know, much has been made that the ICRC might be able to get into the country. That's unacceptable. Get into the prisons. And again, there has to be absolutely no retaliation to those who speak out. I would point out that after testifying here today in public, and I thank C-SPAN especially and the journalists for taking this story and making Americans aware of what is actually happening in Cuba right now as we meet. They will be returning to Cuba. And this committee, and I know the entire Congress will be watching to ensure that their safety and well-being and health is not further jeopardized. But the courage to come forward to a congressional hearings, our friends over on the Senate side receive compelling testimony as well, and to bear witness to an ugly truth of torture. I would ask everyone to go back and reread Against All Hope, Armando Valladares' famous book. He talked about tortures that I don't even want to mention in public. They are so despicable, of putting dissidents in vats of excrement, so bad that it went into their ears and nose and they got infections. Armando Valladares told me that when he and his wife, when they finally got to the United States and got asylum, that when he couldn't even change his children's diapers because the smell of excrement brought back instantaneously, like PTSD, remembrances of that kind of degrading and cruelty imposed upon them. The Castro brothers and many in this regime ought to be at The Hague for crimes against humanity. That's how bad it is. These are among the worst abusers of human rights in the entire world. So again, I want to welcome our brave and courageous witnesses. I want to thank Ileana Ross-Layton and Mario Diaz-Balart. Ileana has been such a leader for so long in raising the truth of what is going on in this Gulag island. I have much more to say, but I will put the rest of it into the record. But I do want to thank our witnesses again, and I look forward to hearing their testimony. I yield to my good friend and colleague, Ms. Bass, the gentlelady from California.
Mr. Chairman, if...
Yes, Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Chairman, I just want to take a brief moment before we turn to the very serious topic of human rights in Cuba to respond to a statement from this subcommittee's last hearing that had troubling interpretations. While discussing your position on marriage equality, you made comments and engaged in a line of questioning that some understood as suggesting that lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people do not have basic human rights. After exchanging letters with you, I think it's important to note that while we do have very different opinions on marriage equality, you strongly oppose it, I strongly support it, we both agree that unequivocally LGBT people have the same rights as all other people to live lives free from violence and persecution. In your letter and your public statement, you said that you, and I quote, unequivocally oppose acts of violence against anyone and believe that human rights apply to all, end quote. And that, and I quote again, all individuals, including LGBT persons, should be treated with respect and compassion. I want to thank you for the opportunity to clear up the confusion over your statement and to reaffirm our shared passion for protecting the human rights of all people. The policy of the United States is absolutely clear. LGBT rights are human rights, and LGBT people are entitled to live lives free from violence, intimidation, discrimination, and harm. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and yield back.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. I would just again say we do have a fundamental difference. I don't support homosexual marriage. I know you do, and I certainly respect your views. And I do want to point out that I am for universally recognized human rights for all, and there is no treaty that recognizes a right to marriage for homosexuals. But again, I'm glad we were able to work together, and I'd like to. Oh. Okay, why don't you go? Okay, you go.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I do appreciate the clarification of that, because I know with your long record on human rights that you would never be okay with the egregious human rights violations that are taking place around the world in the LGBT community, and that there is a fundamental difference between marriage, which many people have a difference around, but I know that there is no difference around LGBT rights and the violence and opposing the violence against LGBT people. So thank you for that. Today's hearing on human rights in Cuba in the context of President Obama's recent announcement, I said yesterday in our Foreign Affairs Committee that sometimes in talking about Cuba, it's difficult because my colleagues and two of my colleagues that are on the other side of the aisle right now in this hearing have family history and personal situations that make it very difficult if one does have a different opinion. I want to, one, respect and acknowledge what my colleagues have been through and what their families have been through, and with no disrespect or disregard for those histories, want to take a few minutes and propose a different viewpoint. You know, the President's policy of opening up relations with Cuba, I actually think is a very good thing, especially for people who are concerned about human rights. During the 5 decades that we have not had relations with the Cuban government and the Cuban people, the Cuban economy did experience multiple economic shocks, which really produced hardships for the people, but none of it really produced the kind of popular uprisings or internal resistance that might have led to a change in government. I also think that the embargo prohibited diplomatic and economic engagement between the U.S. and Cuba, and I think that many times is the ways in which societies become more open and accountable and democratic, and trade and cultural exchange becomes mutually beneficial. I think the embargo has impeded U.S. relations throughout the Western Hemisphere, as many Latin American nations viewed the embargo itself as a human rights violation against the Cuban people. I have to say that as a U.S. citizen, I definitely consider it my human right to be able to travel to any nation on the earth. And I have resented the fact that it has been difficult. I mean, Americans can go to Cuba, and I have been to Cuba, but it's very, very difficult to go there. And I don't believe, and I might be wrong, but I don't believe that we have that restriction against any other nation in the world, including Iran, North Korea, and Saudi Arabia, all of which have extremely troubling human rights records. Such travel restrictions, as well as those of trade, also violate the freedom of U.S. citizens. In recent polling by CBS, ABC News, and The Washington Post revealed that a majority of Americans are supportive of moving away from the policy of disengagement and toward reestablishing ties with Cuba. I also think that engagement would be good for the Cuban people, as people-to-people exchanges and the Cuban-American family travel would increase cultural engagement, assist in family reunification, And this opening of space will provide improved access to Cuba for non-governmental organizations that are focused on governance and human rights, as well as facilitating technical assistance to Cuban civil society groups concerned with improved standards of economic and personal freedoms. I do have to say, Mr. Chair, you mentioned about visiting prisons in Cuba. When I did go, I did visit Alan Gross, and I visited him in prison. And I think that it was important that during the time that Mr. Gross was incarcerated, that a number of members of Congress went over and visited him and pushed for his release, and I think that that was a contributing factor. Again, I just feel that you really can't change people and governments whom you refuse to engage with. And so increased engagement, to me, seems like it would be a contributing factor to improving the human rights situation on the island of Cuba, and I look forward to the testimony from our witnesses today. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. I'd like to now yield to the Chairwoman Emeritus of the full Committee on Foreign Affairs, Congresswoman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen.
Thank you very much, and I also am glad that Mr. Gross is home, but if by visiting Mr. Gross you believe that you have been to a Cuban jail, maybe these dissidents here could tell you what a Cuban jail is really like. But we're thankful that he's home. Or we could ask someone like Mr. Basilio Guzman, who's in the audience today. He served 22 years in Castro's prison. And Mr. Smith, I would like to request unanimous consent to submit into the record a letter from the International Committee of Former Cuban Political Prisoners based in Union City, New Jersey, documenting a list of the many Cubans who are still languishing in Castro's gulag. And thank you to Mr. Guzman for pointing that out.
Without objections, ordered.
Thank you. Mr. Smith, I want to thank you so very much for convening this important hearing, for your unyielding and passionate commitment to human rights, to freedom, not just for the oppressed people of Cuba, but for all people everywhere who suffer under oppressive regimes and who continue to seek the most basic and fundamental rights for many people that they take for granted. Everywhere there is an oppressed person, a political prisoner, there you will find Mr. Smith. So we thank you for that. I also want to welcome our wonderful witnesses, Berta Soler, Sara Fonseca, and Antunez, all champions of freedom on the island and the face of what the democratic future of Cuba will look like. Look at those faces. That is the Cuba now. That is the free Cuba of tomorrow. These are brave pro-democracy activists who have seen firsthand the brutality of the regime by the constant arrests and beatings that they have had to endure, the isolation that they've had to endure while in jail. They did not have food prepared especially for them. They were starved, and after this hearing, they will be going back to Cuba. Amazingly enough, as you pointed out, Mr. Smith, to continue the fight for freedom and democracy. Berta, as a matter of fact, she will be marching with her sisters, the ladies in white, Las Damas de Blanco, this very Sunday. And by the way, while all these negotiations are going on, there were 13 detentions of the ladies in white just last Sunday. So if you think everything is rosy and bright and terrific and all wonderful, just ask these three dissidents what life is like for them. Very unlike what we hear from others. Our witnesses are just three of the countless faces of Cuba who represent the future, who the administration has shut out of the negotiations. And rarely are they invited to meet with visiting dignitaries. We're glad that they get the chance to go to Cuba. Rarely do they invite dissidents who disagree with this administration. These are the people who have to suffer the consequences of the administration's decisions. It's easy for the president to change this policy in his ivory tower. These are the faces who must now suffer under a Castro regime, re-energized. The regime is re-energized by President Obama's policies, by its injections of cash. The president's December 17th announcement serves to both embolden the regime by implying that it can continue its repressive machinery with impunity. Raul Castro said, "We will not change," and we look the other way. It undercuts and it demoralizes the brave freedom fighters in Cuba who rightfully believe that the U.S. has turned its back on them. But don't confuse the U.S. people with the administration, just like we don't confuse the Castro regime with the people of Cuba. And for what are these negotiations? So that more Americans can travel to Cuba and see what the regime wants them to see. All the while, the regime fills its coffers and we ignore the truth. Because who owns the hotels? The Castro regime. Who runs the hotels? The Castro military. The truth about the Cuban regime is that it is a regime that severely punishes dissidents, even to this day. El Decano was sentenced to a year in prison just last week. A young rapper. A rapper is a threat to this regime. Did he commit a crime? No. His charge was dangerousness, which could lead to a crime. It's the precogs of that movie. They predict that you're going to commit a crime, so they arrest you before you commit it. This regime forbids reform and will do anything to maintain its grip on power. The censorship apparatus, one of the most comprehensive in the world. It forbids Cubans from listening to independent, private, or foreign broadcasts, and even censors the signal of its own allies' televised propaganda. It is important, Mr. Chairman, that we understand exactly the kind of murderous regime we're dealing with in Cuba and that President Obama wants to normalize relations with. On November 4th, 1999, the House Committee on International Relations convened a congressional hearing entitled "The Cuban Program: Torture of American Prisoners by Cuban Agents." At that hearing, you remember, Mr. Chairman, we heard testimony from American POWs, prisoners of war, who were tortured at a prison camp in North Vietnam known as the Zoo during the period of August 67 to August 68. According to reports, 19 of those courageous servicemen were psychologically tortured and beaten by Cuban agents working under orders from Hanoi. And while the State Department led the negotiations last month in Havana, its very own country reports on human rights practices for 2013 states this: the following additional abuses continued: harsh prison conditions, arbitrary arrests, selective prosecution, denial of free trial. This is from the State Department, our State Department. They're still negotiating with Castro while this is going on. Authorities interfered with privacy, engaging in pervasive monitoring of private conversations. The government did not respect freedom of speech and press, severely restricted Internet access, and maintained a monopoly on media outlets, circumscribed academic freedom, and maintained significant restrictions on the ability of religious groups to meet and worship. Our own State Department, the government refused to recognize independent human rights groups or permit them to function legally. They can tell you about that. In addition, the government continued to prevent workers from forming independent unions. Where are these voices who are so much for independent unions here in the United States? But not for you. You're not good enough. I'm sorry, no union for you. The most human rights abuse committed at the direction of the government. Our own State Department says this: impunity for the perpetrators remain widespread, end quote, because I could continue. Mr. Chairman, we cannot be the land of the free across the world if this administration doesn't defend democracy right here in our own hemisphere. We cannot call for democratic reform and values throughout the world if we abandon them 90 miles from our shores. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this time. Welcome to our panelists.
Chairwoman Russ-Leighton, thank you for that extraordinarily powerful statement and for your consistent support, again, not only of the Cuban people, but people who are dealing with tyrannies all over the world.
I hope you get your visa.
Thank you.
Don't hold your breath.
I'd like to now yield to my friend and colleague, Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you and Ranking Member Bass for calling today's hearing on this very important issue. I particularly want to thank the witnesses who are here today, and thank you in advance for sharing your insight and your experiences. And I know that some of you are bravely joining us today to share very personal stories of very difficult and painful experiences, and we are really indebted to you for your willingness to do that. As I discussed yesterday with the administration witnesses during our full committee hearing, I like many, continue to have deep concerns about how the Cuban government treats its citizens. But it's clear that the United States policy on Cuba over the past several decades has not worked either. And I'm hopeful that President Obama's effort to engage in real, substantive negotiations toward more honest cultural exchange, economic trade, and diplomatic ties with Cuba will ultimately benefit the United States and, more importantly, the Cuban people. I hope the Cuban government will come to the negotiating table with a real desire to work with the United States toward a more free, open, and tolerant society for the Cuban people. And it's very important for us to pay close attention to the ongoing negotiations to make sure that any changes are implemented in a way that maintains our commitment to promoting basic values and human rights. So I thank the witnesses again for being here and look forward to your perspective as the relationship between the United States and Cuba begins to change. And with that, I yield back, Mr.
Thank you,
Chairman.
Mr. Salini. Well, now I yield to my good friend and colleague who has been a very powerful voice, Mario Diaz-Balart, and thank him for joining us. He's a member of the Appropriations Committee, and he does us the honor of being here today.
Mr. Chairman, let me first thank you for the opportunity to sit in for a few minutes. I will not be able to stay for the entirety of the hearing because I do have other meetings to go to, but I could not let this moment pass without first thanking you, sir, for your just steadfast leadership and your consistent leadership, whether it's been fighting for freedom and supporting the opposition in Vietnam and Communist China and North Korea, wherever there has been oppression. Mr. Chairman, you have always been consistent, just like Chairwoman Emeritus Ileana Ros-Lehtinen. And I want to thank both of you. And I just want to make a couple of comments. And the ranking member, who was very kind in her introduction, mentioned about how some of us might have some family history. The issue of human rights has nothing to do with family history, because I, for one, am opposed to oppression in Communist China, in North Korea, in Vietnam. And I don't know, I was a very young man when we had sanctions against South Africa, and I supported the sanctions in South Africa. I'm assuming that the ranking member was also opposed to sanctions in South Africa, because I'm assuming, obviously, that she is also as consistent as the chairman is on these issues. I supported, as a young man, those sanctions against South Africa, because doing business with the apartheid regime was not to help the struggling freedom, folks who were struggling for freedom in South Africa. All it did was help prop up that regime in South Africa. So, Mr. Chairman, I couldn't let this time slide by without me being here.
Can I ask the gentleman to yield for a second?
Of course, with all pleasure.
You know, I really was only trying to acknowledge the fact that I realized people had personal situations.
And I appreciate that.
wasn't trying to say that, you know, that's the only reason you're concerned about Cuba. It's just hard if you have a different opinion. I just wanted to respect what I knew you and Ileana's family had been through. That was all.
And I thank the ranking woman, and as I said, for your kind statements. I took it as a kind statement. So I want to make sure of that. But I'm just saying that the issue of human rights and the consistency on that is important. When we look at the folks that are here today, I mentioned South Africa. In front of us today are the Mandelas, are the Havels, are the future leaders of a free and democratic Cuba. When folks talk about Cuba, they sometimes confuse the regime with Cuba. No, this is Cuba in front of us today. They who have spent years in prison, Jorge Luis Garcia Perez Antunez, 17 years in prison. By the way, ask him about the conditions of the prisons. Ask Iris Aguilera about how well the Cuban people are treated. Ask Sara Marta Fonseca. Just go to the YouTube and look at her videos to find out how respected and how well the Cuban people who dare just speak out for freedom are treated. Ask Berta Soler about what happens when you just walk peacefully with a flower in your hand going to church and asking for freedom of their relatives. Ask her how the Cuban people are treated. So at a time when, during the State of the Union, our president spoke about Cuba, and by the way, for the first time in my recollection, did I see a president speak in the State of the Union about Cuba and not even mention human rights, not even mention democracy, not even give lip service to elections in Cuba. I am grateful to you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing these heroes, the future leaders, them and others, the future leaders of Cuba, to the United States Congress to testify. Because again, at a time when our president has decided to ignore the repression, the arrests, heck, even the sending of arms to North Korea from the Castro regime, this House, as it always has, will continue to stand with you, with the future leaders of Cuba, with the people of Cuba, and not with the regime. I am grateful for the opportunity, Mr. Chairman, to be able to sit in here for a few minutes. Thank you, sir. I yield
Yes,
back.
Ballard, thank you so very much for your very powerful statement, and which has been consistent throughout the world. I'd like to now recognize Mr. Emmer, gentleman from Minnesota.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and it's difficult to follow that from a new colleague. So I won't try to follow that. All I will do is say thank you for this hearing, Mr. Chairman, and especially in light of the President's decision to somehow restart diplomacy with the regime currently in charge in Cuba. They talk, and there are still concerns for some of us about why the President would have used the process he used, sidestepping the State Department, having over a year of secret meetings that didn't involve normal process. But that part aside, it really is all about the human rights and the Cuban people. Which is why it's so interesting to me. The discussion about normalization of the relationship is really what we're here about today. And I appreciate that you and the ranking member have decided that we're going to bring in some people to talk about some basic freedoms, the situation, exercise the oversight that is the jurisdiction of this committee, because thankfully the President has acknowledged that he does not have the authority to dismantle, as he suggested, the embargo and start to normalize relationships with Cuba. That's up to Congress. And hopefully it starts here today. We can talk about how people can have basic and fundamental rights to assemble with people that they want, to speak freely on their own behalf, and God forbid, even against their government. And that people can actually practice their faith in public and be proud of it. I'm looking forward to being part of the process, and I thank you again for holding this hearing, and for the witnesses, I look forward to your testimony today, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Emmer. I'd like to yield to Ms. Pitcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
A leader on religious freedom, especially in this Congress, and on Chinese human rights.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I deeply appreciate being here, and forgive me for being late. But I want to come to pay tremendous respect to those who've come to testify today. Each of us are still searching on the merits of why the President would make the unilateral decision that he made to provide a diplomatic relationship with Cuba against the wisdom of a dozen previous presidents. What he has done is elevate a terrorist state. Along with Cuba is Syria, Sudan, Iran, that are terrorist states. And now he's declared to the world that this state is acceptable to the United States. It's a very sad day. I have worked for the last 30 years with missionaries in Cuba. They tell me the plight of the religious inequities and the challenges that they face, and people trying to live out their faith. So I'm deeply concerned over the impact of what will happen, the elevation we've given to the Marxist doctrine that will be encouraged throughout the world. We have dealt with Cuba on an ongoing basis in the United Nations. They have sought to engage those to oppose the United states and those of our closest allies, including Israel. So I'm here to pay respect to you and thank you for your commitment and to clearly say to you that we stand with you, fully engaged in behalf of the wonderful people of Cuba. Thank you and God bless you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pittenger. Now, it is now a very distinct honor and privilege to welcome our very distinguished witnesses. They are doing here today in Washington, which they would not be able to do in Cuba, especially before that rogue Congress, where there is really no real election. There's no free and fair elections. Let me begin first with Mr. Jorge Luis Garcia Perez Antunez, who is a leader in the Cuban democratic movement. He was inspired early in life by reading the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, rejecting the communist indoctrination that he was receiving in Cuba's schools. Antunez, as he is known to us all as, is a leader of a nonviolent movement to promote human rights and democracy. He was arrested in 1990 for peacefully protesting the Castro brothers' oppressive regime and spent the next 17 years in jail as a political prisoner. He endured horrific torture, beatings, solitary confinement, and denial of needed medical care that almost cost him his life. Since his release in 2007, Antunez has continued to advance the cause of freedom and human rights in Cuba. He also knows firsthand the discrimination suffered by Afro-Cubans on a daily basis and under-focused upon aggressive racism employed by the Castro regime. We will then hear from Ms. Berta Soler, who has been the leader of the Ladies in White movement following the death of the group's founder, Laura Poyan, in 2011. The Ladies in White is a movement of wives and female relatives of Cuban political prisoners, but now has evolved into a potent, powerful human rights group open to all Cuban women. Ms. Solar and 4 other members of the Ladies in White received the Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought by the European Parliament in 2006. But the Castro brothers barred them from attending the awards ceremony. She and her husband has remained in Cuba since his release, rejecting an offer of immigration from Spain in order to continue their struggle for human rights and democracy in Cuba. I would also note that the Ladies in White have been nominated by Yelena Ross-Layton and I and others in a joint request to the Nobel Peace Prize Committee, along with Dr. Bichette, another Afro-Cuban, a medical doctor, who has been tortured horrifically as well. He testified here, as you know, by way of a phone hookup and told us, do not end the embargo. Get the conditions first. Get human rights and durable human rights at that before that embargo is lifted. And he said it even though there's great risk to himself in articulating that. He pointed out, as many others have pointed out, that the Europeans have been trading with Cuba for decades with no amelioration whatsoever and have been a lifeline, frankly, to a dictatorship which Russia first provided, then Venezuela, and unfortunately trade coming in from Europe and Canada. Then we'll hear from Ms. Sarah Fonseca, who grew up in a household that opposed the communist system based on their principles and their deep religious beliefs. Due to her family's faith, she was denied the right to complete her studies. In 2004, she became a member of the pro-human rights party affiliated with the Andrei Sakharov Foundation. In 2009, she joined the Rosa Parks Civil Rights Women's Movement, for which she became the delegate in the city of Havana. That same year, she also began participating with the Ladies in White as a lady of support. She and her family have experienced numerous organized mob attacks, and her house has been vandalized and searched by government agents dressed in civilian clothes. As a result, she has sought refugee status in the United States. Then we'll hear from Mr. Jeff Thale, who oversees the entire range of the Washington Office of the Latin America's Research and Advocacy on Latin America Policy and Human Rights Issues. Along with a focus on specific countries and themes, Mr. Thale led the team that authored Forging New Ties, WOLA's recommendations for new directions in U.S. policy towards Latin America. Mr. Thale has studied Cuba issues since the mid-1990s and traveled to Cuba more than a dozen times. Wish I could get that visa, including organizing delegations of academics and members of Congress. He coordinates WOLA's advocacy of this issue with coalition of business, agricultural, and human rights groups who favor lifting the general travel ban on Cuba. I'd like to now yield the floor to Antunez.
Bueno, honorable congresista Christopher Smith.
Honorable Congressman Christopher Smith.
Muy buenos días a todos los congresistas, invitados y participantes.
Good morning to all participating members.
Mi nombre es Jorge Luis García Pérez Antunez.
My name is Jorge Luis García Pérez Antunez.
Un exprisionero político cubano quien tuvo que permanecer 17 años de la interrumpida prisión política.
I am a former political prisoner who spent 17 continuous years of political imprisonment
Por el solo hecho de exigir en una plaza pública de mi natal Placetas
for the sole supposed crime of calling out in a public square in my hometown of Placetas
la implementación de aperturas como las que aquella época tenían lugar en la Europa comunista.
for the implementation of reforms such as those that were taking place back then in communist Europe.
Mantuve dentro de la cárcel mi posición como preso político
Within the prisons, I remained steadfast in my condition as a political prisoner.
y por mi constante labor de denuncias de las violaciones de los derechos humanos,
And due to my constant struggle to denounce human rights violations from within prison walls,
fui víctima de las más refinadas modalidades de torturas y tratos crueles.
I was subjected to the most refined forms of torture and cruel punishment.
Como por ejemplo, la
Such as-
mañana del 14 de octubre de 1992,
Such as, for example, on the morning of 14 October 1994,
altos oficiales de la policía política, a pesar de yo estar esposado a las espaldas, me asusaron perros.
high-ranking officers of the political police, in spite of the fact that my hands were handcuffed behind my back, sick dogs on me,
Por no aceptar el plan de adoctrinamiento carcelario de la dictadura,
because I did not accept the regime's indoctrination program within prison walls.
fui confinado en las más inhóspitas y rigurosas prisiones.
I was sent to the most inhospitable and rigorous prisons.
Luego, junto a valerosos hermanos de prisión,
Later, together with very courageous brothers from the prison,
fundamos el presidio político Pedro Luis Boitel,
we founded the Pedro Luis Boitel Political Prisoners Organization,
el que a pesar de la represión agrupó a cientos de presos de la resistencia cívica dentro de las cárceles.
which in spite of repression managed to unify hundreds of political prisoners in order to carry out civic resistance within the prison walls.
Luego de ser encarcelado en el año 2007,
After I was released in 2007,
he continuado la lucha dentro de Cuba, que considero el escenario más importante.
I have continued with the struggle inside Cuba, where I think it is most important.
Actualmente milito en el Frente Nacional de Resistencia Cívica Orlando Zapata Tamayo,
I am currently active in the Orlando Zapata Tamayo National Civic Resistance Front,
una organización nacional que promueve dentro del país las protestas públicas y las defensas de los derechos humanos.
This is a national organization which carries out protests and the defense of human rights throughout Cuba.
Hoy estoy aquí en nombre de mis hermanos de la resistencia
Today I am here in the name of my brothers and sisters of the resistance,
y de manera especial de los encarcelados por sus ideas, los cuales ya suman docenas.
and most especially in the name of those who are in prison for their ideas, which there are dozens of.
A pesar del no convincente proceso de encarcelaciones acordado por el presidente Barack Obama y el dictador Raúl Castro.
They have remained in prison in spite of the unconvincing process of release agreed upon by President Barack Obama and dictator Raúl Castro.
Entre mis hermanos encarcelados quiero mencionar a
Amo-
Ciro Alexis Casanova Pérez,
Among my imprisoned brothers, I want to mention Ciro Alexis Casanova Pérez,
a Ernesto Borges Pérez,
Ernesto Borges Pérez,
Armando Sosa Fortuny,
Armando Sosa Fortuny,
entre otros.
among others.
Son ellos parte de una larga lista de héroes cuyo único crimen ha sido, primero, el de oponerse a la dictadura y segundo, resistir con firmezas los horrores del presidio.
These men are part of a long list of heroes whose only crime has been, first of all, to oppose the dictatorship, and second of all, to continue resisting within prison walls.
Hace unos días conocimos que el presidente de esta gran y hospitalaria nación
A few days ago, we learned that the president of this great and hospitable nation
había acordado con el dictador Raúl Castro el restablecimiento de las relaciones diplomáticas,
had agreed with dictator Raúl Castro to reestablish diplomatic relations,
así como pasos para la posterior eliminación del embargo.
as well as steps leading to the elimination of the embargo.
Y como si fuera poco, canjeó a 3 confesos espías
And as if this were not enough,
Que-
three confessed spies
que participaron en el asesinato de ciudadanos americanos por el contratista Alan Gross.
who participated in the murder of 4 U.S. citizens were exchanged for innocent contractor Alan Gross.
Estos acuerdos, considerados por parte importante de la resistencia cubana como traición a los anhelos libertarios de un pueblo,
These agreements, which are considered by an important part of the Cuban resistance as a betrayal of the hopes for freedom of the Cuban people,
son inaceptables,
are unacceptable,
pues los principios y la libertad de un país no son propiedad de ningún gobierno, por muy poderoso e influyente que sea.
because the principles and the freedom of a country do not belong to any government, no matter how powerful or influential this government may be.
Hay un esfuerzo internacional expresado por los acuerdos Obama-Castro
There is underway an international effort expressed by the Obama-Castro Accords
para promover una supuesta evolución dentro del régimen castrista.
to promote a supposed evolution within the Castro regime.
Este es el cambio fraude promovido por el régimen castrista para perpetuarse en el poder.
This is the fraudulent change promoted by the Castro regime in order to perpetuate itself in power.
Este espejismo está manipulado por la dictadura simple y sencillamente para perpetuarse en el poder.
This illusion is manipulated by the dictatorship in order to perpetuate itself in power.
La dictadura castrista es un sistema irreformable
The Castro dictatorship cannot be reformed.
y basado en el rechazo a la sociedad democrática y todo lo que ésta representa.
The Castro dictatorship is based on the negation of democratic society and everything this represents.
Es una tiranía que aspira no solamente a controlar al pueblo cubano,
The Castro dictatorship not only seeks to control the Cuban people, it also seeks to export this repression.
sino que exporta esa represión a otros países, como es el caso de Venezuela.
It seeks to export this repression to other countries such as Venezuela.
Señores, ¿qué significa un cambio real en Cuba?
What does real change in Cuba mean?
Significa la restitución de todas las libertades civiles.
It means the restitution of all civil rights.
Significa una amnistía general para todos los presos políticos.
It means a general amnesty for all political prisoners.
Significa el derecho a organizar partidos políticos y sindicatos independientes.
It means the right to organize political parties and independent labor unions.
Cambio real en Cuba significan elecciones libres, reales, supervisadas por la comunidad internacional.
Real change in Cuba means free, real elections, internationally supervised free elections.
Significa la separación del poder de los hermanos Castro.
It means the separation from power of the Castro brothers.
Esto está reconocido en la actual ley estadounidense hacia Cuba y debe permanecer.
This is recognized in current U.S. law towards Cuba, and it should remain so.
Y porque constituye de por sí el mejor respaldo posible a la resistencia cubana.
Because it constitutes the best possible support for the Cuban resistance.
Una mayoría de la resistencia cubana ha suscrito el acuerdo por la democracia en Cuba.
A majority of the Cuban resistance has
Una ruta de 10
signed on
puntos
to the agreement.
fundamentales
A majority of the Cuban resistance has signed on to the agreement for democracy in Cuba.
de transición hacia la democracia en Cuba.
This is a roadmap of 10 elemental points towards democracy in Cuba.
Pedimos reconocimiento por parte del Congreso de los Estados Unidos para este documento
We ask recognition from the Congress of the United States for this document
y para lo que representa
and for what it represents
como un claro camino hacia la democracia en Cuba.
as a clear path towards democracy in Cuba.
Le pido al pueblo norteamericano y a este Congreso libremente electo
I ask the American people and this freely elected Congress
que mantenga su firme apoyo al derecho del pueblo cubano a ser libre.
that it maintains its firm support for the right of the Cuban people to be free.
Podemos estar cerca de un cambio real en Cuba.
We may be close to true change in Cuba.
La caída estrepitosa de los precios del petróleo,
The drop in the international price of oil,
la inestabilidad del régimen de Maduro en Venezuela,
the instability of the Maduro regime in Venezuela,
el cual ha sido el principal respaldo al régimen de Castro,
which has been the main supporter of the Castro regime,
la resistencia cívica diseminada por toda la isla
the civic resistance which is widespread throughout the island,
e importantes iniciativas de coordinación de esa resistencia,
and how this resistance is increasingly coordinating itself,
como es el Foro de Derechos y Libertades, indican todo esto.
as is taking place with the Forum for Freedoms and Rights, all indicate this.
Señores, Este es el momento de exigirle concesiones reales a la dictadura castrista.
This is the moment to demand real concessions from the Castro regime.
Solo esto puede significar relaciones normales entre los Estados Unidos y Cuba.
Only this can mean normal relations between the United States and Cuba.
Los cubanos pueden tener el mismo éxito en la isla que han tenido en el exterior.
Cubans can be as successful in the island as they have been abroad.
Lo que necesitamos es libertad.
What we need is freedom.
La resistencia cubana está luchando por esta libertad.
The Cuban resistance struggles for this freedom.
Necesitamos su apoyo y comprensión.
We need your understanding and your support.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Antunez, thank you so very much for that very powerful testimony. How much time do we have? We do have a series of votes on the House floor. We will have to take a short recess, and so Ms. Soler, if you wouldn't mind, we'll just break, then come back for questions. And I do hope that members of the press and our audience will stay, because we have very powerful testimony that awaits. So we stand in short recess. The subcommittee will resume its hearing, and I want to apologize again to our distinguished witnesses for that delay. We did have a series of votes on the House floor, but looking forward to your testimonies. We'll begin with our second witness, Ms. Berta Soler, if you could proceed.
Honorable Congresista Smith.
Honorable Congressman Smith.
Distinguidos miembros del subcomité.
Distinguished members of the subcommittee.
Ante todo, quiero darle las gracias a ustedes por escucharme,
Above all, I want to thank you for listening to me,
así como a todas las personas e instituciones que han hecho posible mi presencia para testimoniar sobre la situación de los derechos humanos en mi país, Cuba.
and also to thank all of the people and organizations who have made it possible for me to testify on the human rights situation in my country, Cuba.
Vivimos en la actualidad un momento especialmente definitorio para el futuro de nuestra nación.
We are presently living through a particularly defining moment for the future of our country.
Tras el recién anuncio del restablecimiento de relaciones entre Cuba y los Estados Unidos.
In the wake of the recent announced reestablishment of diplomatic relations between Cuba and the United States,
Me presento ante ustedes como líder de las Damas de Blanco,
I am appearing here as the leader of the Ladies in White,
agrupación de mujeres activistas por un cambio hacia la democracia en nuestra nación por vía no violenta.
a group of women activists who support change towards democracy in our country through nonviolent means.
Inspirada en el ejemplo de mujeres como Rosa Parks, Coretta King, entre otras.
Inspired by the example of women such as Rosa Parks and Coretta King, among others,
Que con su coraje y determinación trazaron sendero para el pleno disfrute de los derechos civiles en esta gran nación.
who with courage and determination blazed path for full enjoyment of civil rights in this great nation.
A 50 años de los acontecimientos en Selma, Alabama, y testimonio ante un subcomité que, entre otras funciones, atiende a los asuntos de derechos humanos globales.
Now, 50 years after the events in Selma, Alabama, and testifying before a subcommittee whose mandate includes global human rights,
Es para mí un gran honor y una oportunidad histórica comparecer ante ustedes.
it is a great honor and a historic opportunity for me to appear before you.
Hablo también a nombre de numerosos líderes y activistas de derechos de la sociedad civil cubana que me han encomendado la tarea de llevar su voz ante ustedes.
I also speak on behalf of numerous leaders and activists from Cuban civil society who have entrusted me with speaking for them before you.
Es una sociedad civil que se encuentra particularmente reprimida por la intolerancia de un gobierno cuyo ejercicio del poder consiste en las violaciones sistemáticas de los derechos humanos al pueblo cubano.
It is a civil society that is particularly repressed by the intolerance of a government whose exercise of power consists of the systematic violation of the human rights of the Cuban people.
Justo antes de salir de Cuba para asistir a este evento, el pasado 28 de enero, día que recordamos el natalicio del apóstol José Martín,
Just before I left Cuba to be here, last January 28th, the day we celebrate the birth of our founding father, José Martí,
decenas de activistas fueron arrestados en La Habana y otras provincias por intentar colocar ofrendas florales en busto de José Martín.
dozens of activists were arrested in Havana and other provinces for attempting to place offerings of flowers at statues of José Martí.
En su visión totalitaria, la dictadura pretende monopolizar la identidad nacional por medio del uso de la fuerza contra cualquier activista independiente.
In its totalitarian vision, the dictatorship seeks a monopoly on our national identity through use of force against all independent activists.
Las violaciones a los derechos humanos en Cuba han sido documentadas por los organismos internacionales más respetados en la materia.
The most respected international human rights organizations have documented violations of human rights in Cuba.
El 28 de octubre de 2013, la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos emitió una medida cautelar a favor de todas las integrantes de las Damas de Blanco.
On October 28, 2013, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights issued an injunction on behalf of members of the Ladies in White to afford protection in the face of systemic repression by Cuban authorities.
Como protección frente a la sistemática represión de las autoridades cubanas.
To afford protection in the face of systemic repression by Cuban authorities.
Presento ante usted el dictamen oficial de la Comisión a estos efectos.
I submit the official precautionary measure issued by the Commission for these purposes.
Adjunto además un informe de Cubalet sobre la situación penitenciaria cubana.
As well as a report by Cuba Lex, which initiated the case before the Commission.
Solicito que estos informes sean incorporados a las actas de esta audiencia.
I request that these reports be made part of the record of this hearing as documentary evidence for our testimony.
Como prueba documental de lo que aquí exponemos.
As proof of what we are exposing in our testimony today.
Estos documentos demuestran que el tema de los presos políticos, Estos documentos demuestran que el tema de los presos políticos, uno de los más sensibles en la realidad cubana actual.
These documents demonstrate that the subject of political prisoners continues to be one of the most sensitive issues in Cuba today.
Vamos mucho más allá de la liberación circunstancial y periódica de algunos de ellos.
Reaching far beyond the occasional or periodic release of some of them.
Para resolver esta cuestión se requiere una libertad incondicional de todos los encarcelados por motivos políticos en la isla.
Resolving this matter requires the unconditional freeing of everyone who has been jailed for political reasons on the island.
Y la eliminación de todas las disposiciones legales que avalan la represión contra quien piensa diferente al régimen.
And the elimination of all legal restrictions used to repress those who think differently from the regime.
Cuba sigue siendo un país con un gobierno unipartidista.
Cuba continues to be a country with a one-party government.
Donde las libertades fundamentales que son un derecho absoluto en la sociedad norteamericana,
where fundamental freedoms that are an absolute right in North American society
constituye delito contra la llamada seguridad del Estado,
are crimes against what they regard as state security.
En Cuba no existe la separación de poderes, las libertades de expresión y asociación. Continuamos siendo reprimidos y la Constitución establece que el Partido Comunista es la fuerza rectora de la sociedad.
Separation of powers does not exist in Cuba. Freedom of expression and association continue to be repressed, and the Constitution establishes that the Communist Party as the driving force for society.
El derecho a la huelga se considera un crimen y los trabajadores cubanos dentro de la isla y en el extranjero son sometidos a condiciones de trabajo esclavo.
The right to strike is regarded as a crime with workers on and off the island, subject to conditions of labor slavery which have been denounced by international organizations.
Denunciadas por organizaciones internacionales.
At the international level,
Mientras estas condiciones prevalezcan, no es posible hablar de una voluntad de cambio por parte del régimen castrista.
while these conditions prevail, it is not possible to speak of a willingness to change on part of the Castro regime.
El mismo 28 de enero, durante su comparecencia en la tercera cumbre de la CELAC, celebrada en San José de Costa Rica, el dictador Raúl Castro expresó: no cederá un milímetro.
That same January 28th, during his appearance before the third summit of the CELAC held in San Jose, Costa Rica, the dictator Raúl Castro stated that Cuba will not give up 1 millimeter.
Para nosotros, eso significa una continuidad en las golpizas, encarcelamiento, destierro forzoso, discriminación contra nuestros hijos en el sistema escolar.
For us, this signals the continuation of beatings, jailing, forced exiles, discrimination against our children at school.
Y todo tipo de patrón de intimidación y acoso que sufrimos a diario por querer una Cuba plural, democrática e inclusiva.
And all manner of patterns of intimidation and abuse we suffer daily for wanting to see a pluralistic, democratic, and inclusive Cuba.
Nuestras aspiraciones son legítimas por estar avaladas por la Declaración Universal de Derechos Humanos, la cual Cuba es signataria, y los pactos internacionales de derechos civiles y políticos firmados y no ratificados por la dictadura.
Our aspirations are legitimate because they are undergirded by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to which Cuba is a party, and the signed international pacts on civil and political rights which have not been ratified by the dictatorship.
Nuestras demandas son bien concretas.
Our demands are quite concrete.
Libertad para los presos políticos.
Freedom for political prisoners.
Reconocimiento de la sociedad civil.
Recognition of civil society.
La eliminación de todas las figuras delictivas que penalicen la libertad de expresión y asociación.
The elimination of all criminal dispositions that penalize freedom of expression and association.
Y el derecho del pueblo de Cuba a elegir su destino por medio de elecciones libres y plurales.
And the right of the Cuban people to choose their future through free, plural elections.
Consideramos que estas demandas son justas y válidas.
We believe these demands are just and valid.
Más importante aún para nosotros representa el ejercicio más concreto de la política.
Even more importantly, for us, they represent the most concrete exercise of politics.
Un paso en la dirección de la convivencia democrática.
A step in the direction of democratic coexistence.
Cuba cambia cuando cambien las leyes que amparan y protegen las conductas criminales con que actúan las fuerzas represivas y los elementos corruptos que sostienen el régimen.
Cuba will change when the laws that enable and protect the criminal behavior of the forces of repression and corrupt elements that sustain the regime change.
En nombre de los fusilados.
In the name of those that have been executed.
En nombre de los presos políticos cubanos.
In the name of Cuban political prisoners.
en nombre de los pilotos de la organización humanitaria Hermanos al Rescate, asesinados por orden de Fidel Castro.
In the name of the pilots from the humanitarian organization Brothers to the Rescue, murdered on the orders of Fidel Castro.
En nombre de las víctimas del remolcador 13 de marzo.
In the name of the victims from the March 13th tugboat.
En nombre de las víctimas del régimen comunista de Cuba.
In the name of the victim of Cuba's communist regime.
Cuba sí, Castro no.
Cuba yes, Castro no.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Ms. Stoller, thank you very much for that very powerful testimony and for providing very specific benchmarks that the Cuban dictatorship needs to follow if Cuba is truly to be free. Thank you so very, very much. And I'd like to now yield the floor to Ms. Fonseca for such time as you may consume.
Good morning. My name is
Sara Marta Fonseca Quevedo.
Sara Marta Fonseca Quevedo.
Nací en el año 1970 en el seno de una familia que desde 1959 fue declarada desafecta.
I was born in 1970 into a Cuban family that since 1959 had been branded as a dissident from the state.
Catalogados como contrarrevolucionarios por manifestarse en contra de los Castro.
We were classified as counter-revolutionaries because we were opposed to the incipient Castro regime.
Durante más de medio siglo en Cuba, el régimen castrista ha violado y viola los derechos humanos.
For over half a century in Cuba, the Castro regime has violated and violates human rights.
Desde el inicio hubo y hay crímenes, asesinatos, presos políticos y marginados.
From the beginning, there have been crimes, murders, political prisoners, and people discriminated.
Todo el que se manifiesta en contra del régimen es brutalmente reprimido, preso o asesinado.
All those who speak out against the regime are brutally repressed, imprisoned, or murdered.
A pesar de habernos criado dentro del comunismo, nunca nos convencieron de que esta es una forma aceptable de vivir.
In spite of having been raised within communism, they were never able to convince us that is the right way to live.
Como activista por los derechos humanos, organizamos manifestaciones en La Habana.
As a human rights activist, I participated in organizing demonstrations in Havana.
Entre ellas, una histórica manifestación en el 2011 en el antiguo Capitolio Nacional en el centro de La Habana.
Among them, a historic demonstration in 2011 in the old Capitol building in the center of Havana.
Donde 4 mujeres, a pesar de la represión, abrimos una sábana clamando por la libertad de los presos políticos.
On that day, 4 women, in spite of repression, opened a banner displaying a slogan calling for the release of all political prisoners.
Cientos de cubanos fueron testigos de esta protesta.
Hundreds of Cubans witnessed this protest.
Inspiramos a muchos más cubanos que se unieron a nuestras consignas también gritando libertad.
We inspired many Cubans who began to shout along with us for freedom.
Otros hicieron sus propias acciones.
Others carried out their own protests.
En todo momento sentimos el respaldo del pueblo.
At all times, we felt the support of the people.
Esto bien valió la represión que después padecimos.
This protest was well worth the repression that we later suffered.
He sido arrestada repetidamente.
I have been repeatedly arrested.
He sido golpeada a tal punto en las estaciones de la policía que pensaron que me habían asesinado.
They have beaten me senselessly in police stations to the point that they thought they had killed me.
En una ocasión me arrastraron por el pelo 3 mujeres oficiales de la policía de una celda a otra.
On one occasion, 3 female police officers dragged me by my hair from one cell to another.
Mientras me daban patadas en la cabeza y la espalda.
While they dragged me by my hair from one cell to the other, they kicked me in my back and in my head.
Ya en la otra celda y esposada a la espalda, un oficial hombre me pateó con toda su fuerza.
Once I was in the cell they were taking me to, and while I was still handcuffed behind my back, a male police officer kicked me with all his strength in my head.
Como resultado de esto, he quedado permanentemente con el riñón derecho afectado y con serios daños a mi columna vertebral.
As a result of this, I suffered permanent damage to my right kidney and with serious damage to my spinal column.
Hasta este día me afligen fuertes mareos.
To this day, as a result of this beating, I still suffer from dizzy spells.
Es con esta brutalidad y mucho peor
It is with this brutality and much worse
que el régimen castrista mantiene controlado al pueblo cubano.
that the Castro regime controls the Cuban people.
Le muestran constantemente al pueblo el precio de la rebeldía.
They do this to constantly show the people what the cost of rebellion is.
Quiero enfatizar que este tipo de represión se mantiene hoy, ahora mismo en Cuba.
I want to emphasize that this type of repression continues today, right now in Cuba.
El cubano no tiene derecho a elegir sus gobernantes.
Cubans cannot elect their leaders.
Los niños son adoctrinados en las escuelas y quien no se rige por la doctrina impuesta no termina sus estudios.
Children are indoctrinated in schools, and those who do not follow the brainwashing cannot finish their studies.
El régimen ha sumergido al pueblo en la carencia, el hambre y la miseria.
The people have been condemned to scarcity, hunger, and misery by the regime.
Un pueblo sin libertad de expresión, con todos los medios de comunicación controlados y con hambre, es fácil de manipular.
A people without freedom of expression, with all the media controlled by the government, and hungry, are easy to manipulate.
Las personas piensan en qué pueden hacer para alimentar a su familia. Y aunque no quieren lo que están viviendo, solo alcanzan a pensar en la supervivencia.
People think only about how to feed their family, and although they do not like the way they're living, they can only think about survival.
El pueblo cubano está cansado de imposiciones y dictadura.
The Cuban people are tired of imposition and dictatorship.
Para escapar, se aventuran en balsas rústicas en busca de libertad.
In order to escape, they venture out to the sea on makeshift rafts.
Es por estas razones que no estamos de acuerdo con las negociaciones entre el señor presidente de los Estados Unidos, Barack Obama, y el dictador Raúl Castro.
It is for these reasons that we do not agree with the negotiations between the President of the United States, Barack Obama, and dictator Raúl Castro.
¿Por qué negociar con una dictadura sin tener en cuenta al pueblo y su resistencia?
Why negotiate with a dictatorship without taking into account the people and their resistance?
¿Dónde quedan tantos años de sufrimiento, las golpizas propinadas por la policía política a la oposición y el pueblo que reclama libertad y democracia?
What about all the years of suffering, of beatings dealt out by the political police to the opposition and the people when they demanded freedom and democracy?
¿Dónde quedan los presos políticos, los asesinados y desaparecidos?
What about the political prisoners, the murdered, the disappeared?
¿Dónde está lo que da Raúl Castro a cambio?
What has Raúl Castro given in exchange?
Solo cuando sean liberados todos los presos políticos.
Only when all political prisoners are released.
Solo cuando se legalicen todos los partidos políticos y sindicatos independientes.
Only when all independent political parties and labor unions are legalized.
Solo cuando se realicen elecciones democráticas pluripartidistas.
Only when free multi-party democratic elections are carried out.
Solo cuando se respeten los derechos humanos, solo entonces es que se debe levantar el embargo.
Only when human rights are respected, only then should the embargo be lifted.
Le doy gracias a Dios por haber nacido en una familia que me educó en la verdad.
I thank God for having been raised by a family which taught me truth.
Por decir lo que pienso, no pude terminar mis estudios, mis hijos tampoco.
For saying what was on my mind, for stating what was on my mind, I was not able to finish my studies, and neither were my sons.
Mi familia y yo fuimos reprimidos, golpeados, encerrados en celdas.
My family and I have been repressed, beaten. We have been thrown into cells.
Destruyeron nuestra casa asaltándola con palos, piedras.
My house was destroyed by those using sticks, stones,
lanzándonos todo tipo de pinturas, mezcla, basura corrompida.
who hurled all types of paints, tar, waste,
Excremento, líquidos, químicos.
excrement, chemical liquids.
Para esto la policía política contrata turbas paramilitares.
This attack against my house was carried out by paramilitary thugs hired by the political police.
Levantar el embargo significa legitimizar la dictadura,
To lift the embargo means to legitimize dictatorship.
darle oxígeno para que continúen en el poder reprimiendo, encarcelando y asesinando.
To provide them with oxygen so that they stay in power while repressing, jailing, and murdering.
El pueblo cubano no se beneficiaría con el levantamiento del embargo. Esto solo beneficiará al régimen.
The Cuban people will not benefit from the lifting of the embargo. Only the regime will benefit.
La dictadura castrista posee en sus manos cada empresa económica que existe en Cuba.
The Castro dictatorship owns every company that exists in Cuba.
Ningún cubano puede tener su propio negocio. La familia Castro es dueña de Cuba.
No Cuban can own their own business. The Castro family owns Cuba.
Tenemos fe en el futuro de Cuba porque tenemos fe en la lucha de la resistencia cubana.
We have faith in the future of Cuba because we have faith in the struggle of the Cuban resistance.
Es una sola resistencia dentro y fuera de Cuba.
There is only one resistance, inside and outside Cuba.
El Acuerdo por la Democracia, documento histórico suscrito por una mayoría de la resistencia cubana, muestra una clara hoja de ruta hacia la democracia.
The Agreement for Democracy, a historic document signed by a majority of the Cuban resistance, lays out a clear roadmap towards democracy.
Para Cuba, libertad, justicia y democracia ya.
We want freedom, justice, and democracy for Cuba now.
Que Dios bendiga a Cuba y a los Estados Unidos.
God bless Cuba and the United States.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Ms. Fonseca. And thank you for reminding us that these atrocities continue to this day, again underscoring the appalling lack of respect for fundamental human rights by the dictatorship. And so thank you for that great testimony. Mr. Thale, please proceed.
Thank you. I'm Jeff Thale, the Program Director of WOLA, the Washington Office on Latin America. I want to thank Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Bass for convening this hearing on these human rights issues in Cuba. WOLA is a non-governmental organization. For 40 years, we've done research and advocacy on human rights issues in the Americas. I've followed Latin America human rights issues since the mid-1980s, and I've directed WOLA's Cuba program since 1995. I travel there regularly. I try to meet with a wide range of Cubans, academics, Catholic and Protestant church leaders, government officials and government critics, government employees, and people in the small business sector. I've met with the late Oswaldo Paya. I regularly meet with and have met with activists like Elisardo Sanchez. I've had the pleasure of meeting here with visiting Cuban dissidents, including Miriam Leiva and Manuel Cuesta Moroa, who spoke on a panel the other day with Ms. Soler in the Senate. So the question before us today really is, has the United States squandered an opportunity to promote human rights in Cuba following the December 17th announcement? And I think our basic position is that far from squandering an opportunity, our new posture toward Cuba will open new paths to improve the human rights situation and the living conditions of Cubans. It will provide opportunities to advance U.S. values and interests, opening new avenues of engagement through travel and trade for U.S. citizens, for churches, for academic and cultural institutions and businesses. Overall, will enhance the prospects for freedom of expression and for reform on the island. I want to very briefly comment on three issues. One is the human rights situation, general situation in the country. The second, what I see is the failures of a policy of isolation. And the third, kind of quickly, the opportunities for the ways in which engagement can advance the human rights situation and our interests. So on the first question, there is very little doubt, and my colleagues on this panel have talked about it, that there are serious human rights problems in Cuba. No one's unrealistic about that, and no one has a rosy view of the situation. In addition to the human rights situation, I think it's clear that the Cuban economy is overall fairly stagnant. Many people, especially young people, are yearning for real opportunity and don't feel they have it. And in fact, the modest economic growth in Cuba in the last few years has led to increases in inequality, and one group in particular that has not benefited from some modest economic growth is Afro-Cuban families and youth. At the same time, I want to be clear on the other side, the picture in Cuba isn't uniformly grim. Life expectancy in Cuba is about what it is in the United States because of public health measures and medical care. Literacy levels in Cuba are very high as in the United States overall, reflecting universal public education. Cuba just passed legislation this past summer to prevent discrimination based on sexual orientation. So very serious problems, but for all its very serious and very real problems, Cubans probably don't face the kind of issues citizens face in a country like Saudi Arabia or other repressive regimes. So overall, the question isn't whether there's a real human rights issue in Cuba. Everyone agrees that there is. The question is, what can the United States do to improve that situation? For the last 55 years, we've pursued a policy of isolation. And I think it's fairly clear, if you hear the testimonies of the other panelists, that policy has failed to do anything to improve the human rights situation on the island. It's created hardships for Cuban citizens, for normal Cubans, but it has not forced the Cuban government to change its policies or its direction. And in fact, in many ways, it's offered the government a rationale to crack down on dissent. So the policy hasn't succeeded in bringing change in the Cuban government. At the same time, it has relegated the United States, both U.S. government and U.S. society, to the sidelines in Cuba itself. And so if the policy of isolation has failed, and I think it pretty clearly has, the question is, what about a policy of engagement? Now, no one thinks a policy of engagement is a magic solution to the human rights problem in Cuba, but I think it's clear that historically, periods of engagement with Cuba are periods in which we have seen political relaxation, and particularly the release of prisoners. Under President Carter, during the time Pope John Paul II visited, during the 2012 talks with the Church and the Spanish government, all three of them saw significant prisoner releases. And just this past month, following the extensive talks between Cuba and the U.S. government, 53 political prisoners were released, completing the release of everybody on Amnesty International's list of prisoners of conscience. So I think other international actors as well, the government of Spain, the government of Canada, the government of Norway, a number of international groups, including European churches, have seen specific benefits to efforts they've made for engagement with the Cuban government rather than policies of isolation. I think beyond the dialogue with Cuban officials, I think there's some really important things that greater engagement will do. It will help reformers inside the Cuban system. It will provide them more space and opportunity. It will benefit Cuban families and the Cubans who interact with people and people-to-people travelers. It's going to benefit religious interaction and expand contact between U.S. and Cuban churches. Telecommunications is going to offer new opportunities for Internet access and information on the island. So overall, I think it's pretty clear that the policy of engagement is likely to expand family visits and remittances, assist a small but growing private sector, increase cultural and religious contacts, and help Cubans connect to the outside world. And if the United States is interested in helping ordinary Cubans and promoting democratic values, that's the path we ought to pursue. We shouldn't be naive in our expectations about Cuba's political leadership. This is the beginning, though, of a long-term process to reduce tension between the governments and build bridges between the American and Cuban people. Over time, that's going to help empower Cuban citizens and open political space on the island. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. We're joined by a member of the subcommittee who had a previous engagement at the opening part of this hearing, Mr. Clausen, a gentleman from Florida. So I yield time for his opening statement.
Thank you. Thank you for coming today. Mr. Thale, I want to start by thanking you for coming. I just want to say for the record, I'm in a bit of a disagreement here. I think that if foreign direct investment was a good way to get these folks to come around, we would be in a better place right now. The Spaniards have had nice hotels on Varadero for a long time, and it just hasn't had enough of an impact. And so I'm worried that we are just casting a lifeline to folks, to murderous folks that were really about to go under. For Señor García, Señora Soler, y Señora Fonseca, bienvenidos aquí. Gracias por venir. Y sobre todo, gracias por su sacrificio. Si he entendido bien, están diciendo hoy, Cuba sí, Castro no. La gente cubana sí. El gobierno de Castro no. La libertad sí. Y la represión no. En mi país se dice que Vamos a perder la libertad misma aquí si no estamos dispuestos para pelear y luchar para esa libertad. Y en ese sentido, yo creo que ustedes son el mejor ejemplo para nosotros. Un ejemplo no solamente para la gente de tu país, pero para nosotros también. Que hay que luchar para la libertad, para tenerlo para siempre. Entonces, you have my full admiration, my full respect, el respeto total, for what you are doing in the fight that you are waging. An example, not only for your country, but for my countrymen as well. And anything that I can do to help you in this sacred fight, I am willing and enthusiastic to do so. I'm so sad, sometimes brokenhearted, for your suffering and your injuries. And I can't imagine what it would be like. Para mí parece una tristeza inconsolable. And so I want to tell you wholeheartedly how much I support what you are doing. Y cualquier cosa que yo pueda hacer para ayudarles, estoy dispuesto a hacerlo. Gracias por venir aquí.
Mr. Clausen, thank you so very, very much. If you'd like to respond, but Ms. Bass does have a plane to catch and asked if she could say a few words.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank the witnesses for their testimony. I had a couple of questions. I sit on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy, and there's about 27 organizations that are funded to help with activists in Cuba. Some of the organizations are funded in Cuba, and some of them are funded in Miami. And I just wondered, one, if you thought that the funding was helpful. And then also, the three of you are here today, and I just wondered how you were able to come. Are you here for a long time, or how you were able to get out of Cuba? Do you travel back and forth? Those are the questions I wanted to ask the three of you, and then I would like to direct a question to the other witness.
Así traduzco.
Sí.
Yes.
Por supuesto que todo tipo de ayuda que se reciba en Cuba para la oposición es muy importante.
All types of aid received by the opposition in Cuba is very important.
Yo puedo decirles que gracias a la ayuda que se recibe en Cuba, en muchas ocasiones se ha podido salvar una vida.
I can tell you that thanks to the aid we have received in Cuba, we've been able to save at least one life.
Y voy a poner un ejemplo.
And I'll give you an example.
Cuando usted tiene un teléfono celular en la mano, tiene un arma para defenderse.
When you have a cell phone in your hand, you have a weapon with which to defend yourself.
Sin esa ayuda sería imposible para un cubano de a pie adquirirlo.
Without the aid we get from abroad, we couldn't pay for that cell phone.
En muchas ocasiones se ha corrido la voz de un lado al otro de la isla reclamando la libertad de alguien, de algún opositor que ha sido injustamente encarcelado, golpeado y que no se sabe en qué lugar está.
On many occasions, we have been able to transmit from one corner of the island to the other about an activist who has disappeared or arrested, who otherwise there would be no news about.
Y gracias a esa comunicación, gracias a esa comunicación, los hermanos de la oposición nos activamos para salir a las calles a reclamar su libertad, que aparezca nuestro hermano que está desaparecido.
And thanks to that kind of communication, we're able to go out into the streets and to demand freedom for those who have been arrested.
You know, I was I'm relatively new on the board, so I was just learning about the funding. But given that we don't even have mail exchange, not much, I don't think, between our two countries, I was surprised that you were even able to get any aid from the United States.
Es claro y es evidente que de un familiar a otro sí se reciben ayudas.
Yes, it is very clear that you can receive aid from one family member to another.
Por eso es tan importante el exilio cubano también.
That's why the Cuban exile community is so important.
And then also about your travel, are you able to go back and forth between the United, I mean, I know you're here today for this. I don't know if you've been here for a while, but you're able to go back and forth?
Bien, yo estoy aquí como refugiada política.
In my case, I'm a refugee in the United States.
Okay, I see.
Sí, ya entiendo.
But you guys are going back, right? Didn't you mention that you were?
Yes, he says he's going to respond.
Oh, okay.
En este momento podemos salir algunos activistas de derechos humanos gracias a las ONG y a las personas de buena voluntad que nos hacen llegar la ayuda para poder llegar acá.
At this moment in time, some activists are able to leave Cuba and come back thanks to the aid that we receive from some NGOs.
Pero esto no significa que estamos libres, puesto que hay muchos activistas de derechos humanos que el gobierno cubano le impide llegar aquí de una forma temporal.
This doesn't mean that we're free, because there are many activists who are impeded from leaving Cuba by the regime.
Sure, no, I mean, I was just surprised. Anybody was that, you know, I understand, especially financially, but the fact that you were able, because they know what you're doing, right?
Sí, quiero ponerle un ejemplo. Tenemos expresos.
I want to give you an example. There are former political prisoners.
12 hombres del grupo de los 75 que han sido escarcelados y tienen medida cautelar o tienen licencia extrapenal y no pueden salir temporal.
There are at least 12 former political prisoners who are part of a larger group of 75 who were released from prison but are still under house arrest and they can't leave Cuba.
Un ejemplo más reciente, tenemos a la dama de blanco Sonia Alfonso Álvarez, que fue escarcelada el día 9 de diciembre cuando fue a solicitar su pasaporte. Este viernes se le ha sido negado.
And I give you a more recent example. One of the ladies in white, Sonia Alfonso Alvarez, she was released on 9 December, and when she went to request her passport, it was denied to her.
Yo llamo reformilla migratoria a lo que Raúl Castro hizo en el 2013, mientras que él pueda seleccionar quién entra y sale del país. No son reformas migratorias.
I label the change that Raúl Castro did in 2013 as a petty reform. As long as they can determine who leaves, who enters, there's no freedom to travel.
Okay, and then finally, because I promised the chair I would be quick, I wanted to ask Mr. Thale, if you could talk about some of the, in the president's proposals, it's going to allow more economic exchange between our two countries. And I'm wondering what impact you think that might have, especially on the freedom or lack thereof of people to open up their own businesses. I mean, I understand there's some businesses like people that have restaurants in their homes and stuff like that. I don't know to what extent there's extensive free enterprise, but do you think that that is ultimately going to assist the development of that?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. So Cuba, 10 years ago, about 90% of the population of the Cuban workforce worked for the state or state businesses. Today, that's probably down to about 70%. The number of people who work for themselves in small businesses has gone up to from about 150,000 4 years ago to about 500,000 now. So there has been a substantial increase. Some of those businesses are quite successful and have 12, 15 employees. The vast majority of them are small vendors, small restaurants, people selling and dealing out of their home. I think that the opening we've offered to the private sector, it's going to take a while for that to work through, but it is clear that it will strengthen the capacity of those businesses and the creation of a small private business sector. I think we'll see change in that area over time.
Thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, just let me introduce Basilio Guzman, who was a political prisoner for 22 years and was subjected to heinous torture, unbelievable acts of brutality. Thank you for joining us at today's hearing and for your courage. I'd also like to introduce Yuris Tamara Perez Aquiera, who is the wife of Antunez, if you would, and a leader in her own right. She founded the Rosa Parks Civil Rights Movement and has spoken out bravely along with her husband. Thank you for joining us at today's hearing as well. I'd like to ask a few opening questions, then yield to my distinguished colleagues. First of all, if you could, Antunez, Mr. Antunez, if you wouldn't mind, speaking to the issue of the mistreatment of Afro-Cubans. I've learned over the last several years, and I have been working human rights issues. I've been in Congress 35 years. I've been working human rights issues for 35 years. But there's been I think, a lack of attention given to the additional mistreatment endured by Afro-Cubans. All people who aspire to freedom and democracy, the full weight of tyranny comes down upon them. But there also seems to be a further differentiation and focus, negative bias, prejudice against Afro-Cubans. If you could speak to that.
Sí, mira, bueno, aprecio sinceramente el interés y la preocupación que tienen todos acá.
I appreciate your concern and your interest that all of you have shown today
para con la causa de Cuba.
For the cause of Cuba.
A unas personas que apoyan o discrepan con la política de Barack Obama.
Even, and I appreciate that concern even from those who are in agreement with Barack Obama's policy.
Antes de responder concretamente las preguntas, quisiera hacer una reflexión.
Before I answer your question directly, I'd like to reflect upon something.
Y es que con todo el respeto que merece uno de los panelistas,
and with all due respect for one of the panelists,
sentí hace un rato un dolor muy fuerte.
I felt great pain a few moments ago.
Me sentí muy molesto.
I felt ill at ease.
Al escuchar de su boca, la situación de Cuba no es bastante mala.
To listen from you that Cuba's situation is bad, but not that bad.
La situación de Cuba no es bastante mala. Reitero.
The situation in Cuba is bad, but not that bad.
No sé, con el mayor respeto que merece, qué entiende él por situación mala.
I really don't understand, with all due respect, what you mean by a situation that is bad, but not that bad.
Y en los momentos que él habla, pienso en las madres cubanas.
And when you say this, I think about Cuban mothers
que se acuestan llorando porque no tienen que llevarle a sus hijos a la boca el día siguiente.
who go to sleep crying because they have no food for their kids the next day.
Pienso en las miles y miles de jóvenes que tienen que prostituir su cuerpo.
I think of those thousands of young women who've had to become prostitutes.
Alimentar a sus hijos, a su familia.
Who've had to become prostitutes so they can feed their families.
Pienso en el nulo poder adquisitivo que tiene el cubano de a pie.
I think of the fact that Cubans can barely afford to
Pienso
live.
en la disparidad de vida entre los jerarcas del régimen y el pueblo.
I think about the gross inequality between the regime leaders and the people.
Pienso en la pobreza moral, espiritual y sobre todo económica que padece nuestro pueblo.
I think about the moral, spiritual, and economic poverty of the people of Cuba.
Puede ser que Cuba tenga algún logro en la educación.
There may be some educational achievement in Cuba.
Pero cuando se trata de una educación totalmente adoctrinada,
but when we're talking about a system of education which consists of indoctrination,
cuando jóvenes como los tres que estamos acá, que venimos de Cuba, no pudimos tener acceso a la educación superior por nuestros criterios políticos.
When all three of us who are here were discriminated from pursuing higher education as youth because we had different political ideas.
Creo que eso destroza, con el todo respeto que usted merece, su argumento.
I think that invalidates, with all due respect, your argument.
Cuba es muy cierto que es una potencia médica, es verdad.
It's true, Cuba is a medical power.
Pero no para Sara Marta Fonseca, ni para Berta Soler, ni para Iris Tamara.
But Cuba is not a medical power for Sara Marta Fonseca, for Berta Soler, or for Jorge Luis García Pérez.
En Cuba hay muchas clínicas altamente sofisticadas que quizás no tengan nada que envidiarle a las que están en los países desarrollados como este.
Cuba has many sophisticated hospitals and clinics which are first world
Pero
status.
esas clínicas como la Sierra García y el CIMEC son dolarizadas.
But those clinics, like the Cira Garcia or the CIMEX, are only for people who can pay with dollars.
Para turistas oportunistas o para la clase élite del poder.
They're only for tourists or for the elite.
Escuché también de usted decir que el problema de derechos humanos no es tan serio.
I also heard you say that the human rights situation is not that grievous.
Qué dolor para este joven escuchar ese argumento.
how hard it must be for somebody like Ciro Alexis Garcia to listen
Que
to
no
it.
es tan serio estar un joven en la prisión por sacar un cartel que pedía libertad y derecho a los respetos humanos.
Is it not that bad to be in prison merely for displaying a sign calling for freedom?
No es tan serio el caso de Ernesto Borges Pérez.
Is it not that bad to be in prison like Ernesto Borges?
Y quiero hacer énfasis en este caso.
And I want to emphasize this case.
El señor Barack Obama logró la excarcelación de 3 espías confesos
Mr. Barack Obama released 3 confessed spies from the U.S.
que atentaron contra la seguridad y estabilidad de este país.
who were conspiring against the stability and the security of this country.
Sin embargo, este joven tiene 30 años de sanción
However, this young man was sentenced to 30 years in prison,
y lleva 18 presos. ¿Por qué?
and he spent 18 years in prison
Por evitar que 26 espías castristas fueran enviados aquí a asesinar y a desestabilizar el país.
because he passed on information to the U.S. about 26 Cuban spies who were being sent to the U.S. to conspire against the U.S.
La situación de Cuba no es tan seria, es extremadamente seria.
Now, Cuba's situation is not that Cuba's situation is not that bad. It's extremely bad.
Y sin pretender romper el protocolo, quisiera responder cronológicamente algunas de las reflexiones realizadas por usted en un principio.
And if you will allow me, I want to comment upon your
Le voy a
reflections.
ayudar al honorable presidente de esta sala una de sus preguntas o reflexiones.
And I want to address directly what you asked.
¿Por qué no puede entrar usted en Cuba y en las cárceles?
I want to ask, why is that you can't go into Cuba? Why is that you can't travel to Cuba?
Porque de hacerlo verá negros y negros, una población penal extremadamente abarrotada de negros.
Because if you're allowed to go into a Cuban prison, all you will see are black people, hundreds of black men.
Hombres lanzándose de azoteas,
You will see men who would rather jump from a rooftop
perros mordiendo a inocentes,
and commit suicide, or you will see men being bitten by dogs.
el golpe de palo, el escarnio,
You will see the beatings. You will see the persecution.
altas y desproporcionadas sanciones,
You will see these very far-flung sentences, these very high sentences,
así como decenas y decenas de presos políticos de los cuales prácticamente no se hizo mención en las negociaciones.
You will see dozens and dozens of political prisoners who weren't even mentioned in these negotiations.
Quiere llegar a Cuba, pues solamente diga que no va a visitar las cárceles, que no va a reunirse con la oposición.
If you want to go to Cuba, simply tell them that you're not going to visit the prisons and that you don't want to meet with dissidents.
Creo que esto responde en alguna medida las preguntas que me han hecho.
I think this addresses what you asked about discrimination in Cuba.
Mr. Antunez, thank you very, very much. Let me, the Washington Post has done several editorials very, very critical of President Obama's opening up or moving towards opening up diplomatic relations or further relations. And they made a very, very salient point that I would just like to underscore here, and that is that we're repeating mistakes that have been made in the past. When Bill Clinton went to Vietnam and opened up or opened up relations with Vietnam, which followed very quickly with the bilateral trade agreement under President Bush, many of us said it was a mistake not to get human rights reforms, durable reforms first, and then move to the diplomatic recognition followed by an economic relationship. The Post points out that it is the way Mr. Obama has gone about this that is a mistake. Not reform first, but moving in to provide a lifeline, as one of their editorials pointed out, a lifeline to a dictatorship at a time when Venezuela is less capable to provide funding. And we know several years ago that funding from what was then the Soviet Union ceased to exist. A very opportune time to press the case for human rights, and we blew it when it came to Vietnam. I have had passed in this Congress, 3 Congresses and counting, the Vietnam Human Rights Act. The majority leader, now minority leader, Harry Reid, would not put it up for a vote, but 3 times bipartisan legislation with clear benchmarks towards Vietnam, because they are in a race to the bottom with China and North Korea. Cuba is already there. And yet we're moving in having not learned a single lesson from those failed openings where they get stronger, the dictatorship becomes further empowered. I firmly disagree, Mr. Thale, with your comment about isolation. We're talking about financially enabling a lifeline, to quote the Washington Post. And one of their editorials was President Obama's betrayal of Cuban Democrats. Many of those, some have already been rearrested that were let out. And of course, as I pointed out, there were just under 200 that we know of that have been arrested in the last several weeks alone. So that has been the game that Fidel Castro plays. He lets people in and out, but always this sort of Damocles hanging over the entirety of this dictatorship. But I have a question, if I could, on an issue, and then I'll yield to my good friend and colleague, Chairwoman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen. I have been working, and I am a leader in the area of combating human trafficking. I'm the prime author of what's known as the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. It is our landmark law to combat modern-day slavery. Well, the State Department has a Trafficking in Persons Office created by my law, and they put an annual listing of countries using what we contained in the law called minimum standards. The worst designation is Tier 3. Cuba, again, is a Tier 3 country, an egregious violator of trafficking with full complicity of the Castro brothers and the rest of that government, making money hand over fist by forcible prostitution and by child prostitution. I was, in 2004, Frank Calzone had documentation and was working in the Human Rights Commission in Geneva. He had documentation of the complicity of this dictatorship with child prostitution and child exploitation, and he was knocked out cold, hit in the face by Cuban so-called diplomats, thugs. Freedom House came to his defense and made a very strong statement against it because he was bearing witness to that ugly truth of child prostitution. And again, the State Department chronicles this. Cuban citizens have been subject to forced prostitution outside of Cuba as well. And then child prostitution and child sex tourism continues. In the hotels that were mentioned by Mr. Clausen and in other places, renting children. That is the reality of what this barbaric regime is all about. They make money by child sex tourism. And again, it's not an open society. I would love for investigators to be able to go there and, of course, look to bring charges against those, including higher-ups in the government. Tier 3 country. I'd like to ask any of our witnesses if they'd like to speak to the despicable record of Cuba when it comes to the modern-day slave trade. It's not that bad. I'll go to you.
Bueno, es muy importante que sepan que el gobierno cubano promueve, estimula la prostitución infantil en Cuba.
It is very important for you to know that the Cuban government promotes child prostitution in Cuba.
El gobierno cubano sabe que hay muchos jóvenes que no van a las escuelas y están buscando el turismo para poder llevar dinero y comida a su casa.
The Cuban government knows that there are many youths who don't go to school but who are on the streets looking for ways to make money to feed their families.
En estos mismos momentos es penoso, pero tengo que decirlo.
It is shameful to say, but I must say,
La semana pasada oí a unas jóvenes que dicen que se estaban guardando, preparando para cuando entrara el turismo norteamericano, prostituirse porque ellos daban más dinero.
just last week there was a group of young women saying that they were organizing themselves and preserving themselves for when American tourism arrived so they could sell themselves to American tourists.
Si vamos a llamar empoderamiento, cientos de cubanos jóvenes que van a prostituirse.
If we call the prostitution of hundreds of Cuban youths empowerment,
si vamos a llamar empoderamiento, el cubano que sale a trabajar y a robarse la producción para llevar dinero a su casa.
if we call Cubans who are going to try and steal and take from their places of work in order to feed their families, if we call this empowerment,
si vamos a llamar empoderamiento, mujeres como las damas de blanco que salen a ejercer su libertad de movimiento y asociación en las calles y son golpeadas y arrastradas por la fuerza represiva.
if we call empowerment that women like the ladies in white who go out in the streets to demand freedom and respect for human rights and are beaten, if we call this empowerment,
si vamos a llamar empoderamiento cuando el gobierno cubano lleva a maestros a la escuela que son para necesitan todavía ellos educarse.
If we call empowerment, the Castro regime fills schools with teachers who are poorly trained,
donde hijos de activistas de derechos humanos son suspendidos en las escuelas, son suspendidos en las pruebas porque sus padres son activistas de derechos humanos.
the children of human rights activists are failed in their tests and they're damaged or harmed in their studies because their parents are involved in human rights activity.
Realmente esto no es lo que queremos para Cuba.
This is not what we want for Cuba.
El gobierno cubano está buscando que Cuba tenga el mismo modelo chino.
The Cuban government is trying to build a Chinese model in Cuba.
El gobierno cubano está buscando oxígeno.
The Cuban government is looking for?
El gobierno cubano está buscando oxígeno.
The Cuban regime needs oxygen and needs air.
El gobierno cubano lo que quiere para Cuba es un sistema económico capitalista
The Cuban government wants a capitalist economic system
y un sistema político comunista.
and a communist political system.
Llevamos más de 50 años y no podemos permitir esto.
We can't tolerate this after over half a century.
Primero derechos humanos y después economía.
Human rights first, economy second.
El pueblo de Cuba está muriéndose de hambre y no es por el gobierno norteamericano.
The Cuban people are suffering hungry not because of the American government.
El pueblo de Cuba está muriéndose de hambre porque el sistema comunista no funciona.
The Cuban people are hungry because the communist system doesn't work.
No queremos una sucesión de mandatos.
We don't want a succession in Cuba. We don't want a continuation of the regime.
No queremos dinastía.
We don't want a dynasty in power.
Queremos elecciones libres.
We want free elections.
Realmente los recursos que son para el pueblo de Cuba,
The resources that are for the people of Cuba,
Raúl Castro los coge para fortalecer, equipar y perfeccionar su maquinaria represiva contra el pueblo de Cuba y contra la sociedad civil.
the resources that are meant for the Cuban people, Raul Castro will take to strengthen the repressive apparatus.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
I yield to Chairwoman Eleanor Slaton.
Thank you so much, Mr. Smith. Thank you for calling this important hearing. Thank you to our witnesses who are victims of the Castro regime for being here today. Antunez, Berta, Sara, Iris, I'm humbled to be in your presence. Some of you live in Cuba, others are here now but have family in Cuba, so I know that you are very brave for being here today. This is sort of an insurance policy that you have offered them, Mr. Smith, because by being here today, perhaps they will have some degree of protection that those other figures, as brave as you are, won't have. So I know you worry about them. Thank you for holding up their photos. Thank you for describing the current dismal human rights situation in my native homeland of Cuba. And I wanted to just give this statement and then ask you some questions. How has the regime's treatment of its critics changed since December 17th? Do you think this announcement will force changes? I'll ask you to respond in a minute. How does the regime manipulate the press here in the United States and elsewhere, and visitors and tourists on the island that may come back here with a distorted picture of what's going on? This morning I did a radio interview, and the reporter says, I know Cuba. I was there for a week. Antunez and Berta, you will hear, you've heard from some today, that Castro's Cuba is a picture of equality, that the regime supports everyone's rights, including the rights of Afro-Cubans. Thank you for pointing out the kind of apartheid government that exists there, especially the medical apartheid and the prison apartheid. Thank you for pointing out the mistreatment of the Afro-Cubans. And Mr. Thale, you testified that the picture in Cuba is not a uniformly grim one. The fact that you essentially say, hey, look, it could be worse. I suppose so. It can always be worse. And it's particularly disgusting, and it's an affront to the panelists who sit beside you, and the countless number of people who have been jailed for expressing their God-given and fundamental human rights, to thousands who have died trying desperately to flee Cuba. This is such a worker's paradise where the situation is not that bad that I see people in my district, they wash ashore trying to flee Castro's Cuba. Even now, as all of these negotiations have taken place, 40% increase in the number of Cubans fleeing this situation that is not that bad. People who live in constant fear because the regime is watching them closely, or the millions more who have managed to flee over the years. You're repeating the Castro propaganda about good public health care. These are the constituents that I represent now. They fled Cuba. You should come to Miami and meet with my constituents and have them tell you about this great medical care. I've seen it in the Michael Moore documentary, Sicko. Where does that exist? Where is that medical care for these folks? I know that if you're a tourist, you will certainly be treated well. It's good propaganda. Public education, advancement of LGBT rights. The real truth is that the good medical care is just a show for the Castro regime, reserved only for the regime officials and the tourists. I know because I represent that community. My district is overwhelmingly Cuban Americans. I don't know how I got elected. It's just a fluke, I guess. But these are the folks who vote for me and who vote for Mario and vote for Carlos Curbelo, vote for Marco Rubio, vote for Bob Menendez and Albio Sears. But we know that the system of medical care in Cuba, and for the vast majority of Cubans, they have no access to the system. Please interview the people as they get off the planes from Cuba. Dr. Oscar Elias Bisset, thrown in jail for disclosing the truth about abortions being committed and the poor hospital conditions. And Mr. Smith has brought that out time and time again. Life expectancy rates and other healthcare statistics in Cuba, where do we get those from? You're doing a survey in Cuba? They're manipulated by the regime. It is unbelievable that we swallow this. And you've fallen into the trap, Mr. Thale, that the Castro set for you, willing to swallow the regime propaganda, spread it to them, to give it legitimacy. They're utter falsehoods and repeat it over and over again to the detriment of the truth, of the public, and especially the Cuban people. It's such a great system, the public education system. As these witnesses have pointed out, it's a public indoctrination program. Have you seen the textbooks? Meant to stymie free thinking and free will. Progress on sexual discrimination, please. I have met with prominent Cuban LGBT advocates, Wendy Iriepa Diaz and Ignacio Estrado Cepero, and they have vigorously dismissed the claims of progress on LGBT. They've condemned the continued denial of human rights for everyone. The Castro regime will protect LGBT rights if you agree with the Castro regime. They will protect anyone who agrees with the Castro regime. But be an LGBT individual in Cuba and speak out against the regime. See how far that gets you. So my first question to you, Mr. Thale, is can you honestly look at your co-panelist in the eye and tell them that the picture in Cuba isn't a particularly grim one? It's not that bad. And that the torture, the beatings, the imprisonment, the harassment that they have had to endure isn't particularly grim. Your 17 years in prison, not particularly grim, not that bad. The beatings of Las Damas de Blanco, including 13 who were detained on Sunday, but the press doesn't cover that anymore because they want to have their bureau in Havana. And you talk about how the engagement has led to the release of political prisoners. You point to this false list of 53 as part of the December 17th announcement. But what happens the next day when we're not looking, when people aren't looking for Cuba, when the press has done their stand-ups and they've got their bureau, they don't want to lose that bureau. Oh, no. How many more of these dissidents are rearrested? How many more are detained? How many of the 53 had been released prior to the agreement? Or are you under the fallacy that that 53 list is authentic? Haven't some of them been rearrested? And what about those other ones who never made it to the list? Why 53? There were 9,000 in prison last year, according to reports. And how about those individuals that Mr. Antunez held up? What's happened to them? The modus operandi of the regime is to do this bait and switch, to release some prisoners out of expediency, to promulgate its propaganda, and then when the spotlight is off, rearrest those people or find new ones to throw in jail. But now, they don't even have to wait until the press attention is out. Like I said, just on Monday, a young rapper was put in jail for a year for dangerousness, which could lead to a crime. How can you justify that? How can you say, oh, we've liberated these 53, and it's not that bad? I want to ask you, to our panelists here, Mr. Antunez, has it not been that bad for you? When you were in jail, not that bad, not that grim. And Berta, and Sara.
Yo creo que la situación, el cuadro violatorio de derechos humanos dentro de Cuba,
I think that the situation with the violation of human rights in Cuba
es mucho más difícil que lo que pudiéramos nosotros narrarlo.
is much worse than we can describe.
Se ha escrito mucho, se ha llevado al cine,
It's been written about, some documentaries have been made,
pero yo creo que ninguna expresión es posible, ningún talento y expresión artística, por muy avesada que esté sea,
but none of them capture the full reality.
pueda narrar con tanta crudeza lo que es el presidio.
They can't capture the brutal reality of imprisonment in Cuba.
Quizás algunas personas que no tengan una noción o una idea clara o una información completa de lo que es una prisión cubana,
Maybe those who don't have a very good idea or don't have all the information about what a Cuban prison is like
pudiera tal vez pensar que un prisionero en Cuba solamente está privado de libertad.
could come to think that a prisoner in Cuba is merely deprived of their freedom.
Pudiera desconocer que a los presos en Cuba les inyectan agua,
They could ignore that Cuban political
inyectarle algún calmante.
they could ignore that Cuban political prisoners are injected with water and told that they're being injected with some kind of sedative.
Las celdas de Boniato, de Ahuica, de Nieves Morejón son fieles testigos de asesinatos, de palizas,
There have been cells throughout Cuban prisons where murders and beatings have taken place.
de suicidios clínicamente inducidos.
There have been clinically induced suicides which have taken place in Cuban prisons.
A mí nunca se me podrá borrar de la mente
I will never forget.
la imagen de Samuel Simpson González
I will never forget Samuel Simpson Gonzalez
cuando fue compelido o impelido por las autoridades para lanzarse de un tercer piso en la prisión Kilo 8.
when he was manipulated by the prison authorities to jump off a third-story rooftop.
Así como el uso de la Shakira como método de tortura.
I will never forget the use of Shakira, a device for torture in Cuba.
No quisiera ocupar mucho tiempo contando los horrores del presidio,
I don't want to consume too much of your time telling you about all the horrors of the prisons,
porque las muestras de tortura son tantas,
because
tan disímiles,
I have so many examples of torture
que no alcanzaría el tiempo.
that we wouldn't have enough time for me to go over all of them.
Si me preguntaran cómo catalogaría el presidio,
If you ask me how I could describe political imprisonment in Cuba,
le diría que le preguntaran a Dante
I would ask you to ask Dante
en su obra Cumbre.
and find it in his great work.
Creo que no se puede hablar de un proceso de entendimiento, de diálogo, de democratización y de acercamiento
You can't talk about process of engagement, of dialogue, of understanding,
si obviamos un tema tan importante, tan crucial y tan sagrado como los presos políticos.
if you ignore something as important, as crucial, as essential as political prisoners.
Muchas veces hablamos del embargo
We often talk about the embargo,
y lo oímos mencionar en foros.
and we hear it mentioned in different forms.
Voces elocuentes se levantan en contra del embargo.
Eloquent voices speak out against the embargo.
Sin embargo, uno de los congresistas que ahora no se encuentra presente
However, one of the members of Congress who is not present right now
culpa al embargo de no poder ir a Cuba.
blames the embargo for not being able to go to Cuba.
Sin embargo, muy pocos o ellos mismos no han mencionado el único embargo, el más criminal embargo,
But it should be mentioned, perhaps they should mention that the only
o mejor
real,
dicho, bloqueo
embargo, the only real blockade
que enfrenta nuestro país,
that the Cubans face
que es esa cruel y criminal tiranía
is the cruel, criminal Castro dictatorship
que sin el más mínimo pudor golpea en defensa a mujeres cada domingo,
that does not limit itself and on a weekly basis beats women on the streets,
que asesina clínicamente a una valiente mujer como Laura Pollán,
a regime who murdered in the hospital a courageous woman like Ladies of White founder Laura Pollán,
o asesina retirando el agua por 18 días a un prisionero político como Orlando Zapata Tamayo.
or who murdered Orlando Zapata Tamayo by not letting him drink water for 18 days.
Van a haber cambios, sí, van a haber mejorías, ¿cómo no?
Yeah, there will be changes, there will be improvements,
Pero no va a ser para el pueblo,
but not for the people.
va a ser para ese régimen
It will be for that regime
que tanto encarcela,
that has imprisoned so many Cubans,
que tanto reprime
that has repressed Cubans,
y que, como decimos en buen cubano, lleva la voz cantante o el mando en estas conocidas negociaciones.
and that is frankly carrying the lead in these negotiations, or taking the lead in these negotiations.
Quiero decir que las personas que estamos aquí sentadas
Those of us who are sitting here
no nos consideramos extremistas
are not extremists.
ni retrógradas,
We're not backward-looking people.
ni estamos en contra de las políticas de acercamiento o entendimiento.
We're not against policies of engagement
Pues
and
pensamos que la
understanding.
mejor manera de dirimir los conflictos
And we think that the best way to solve a conflict
es acercándonos,
is by approachment.
pero lo que no podemos aceptar
But what we can't accept,
es que se continúe confundiendo a Cuba con el régimen criminal que la oprime.
what we can't accept is that you confuse Cuba with the regime that oppresses
Lo
Cuba.
que no vamos a aceptar ni tenemos por qué aceptar
What we will not accept, and we have no reason to accept,
es que se ignore y se pase por alto actores tan importantes de la situación cubana como son la oposición y el pueblo.
is that the Cuban opposition be ignored in these negotiations.
El régimen de Castro ha encontrado en esta política de acercamiento de Barack Obama
The Castro regime has found in Barack Obama's engagement policy
parte de los incentivos que necesita para continuar reprimiendo
part of the incentives it needs in order to continue repressing,
y para lograr su continuidad,
and in order to maintain itself in power,
así como legitimarse en la arena internacional.
as well as to legitimize itself internationally. These accords have been very
La
severe.
resistencia cubana irreconoce
The Cuban resistance does not recognize
esos acuerdos
these accords,
y no le damos autoridad moral ni ejecutiva a ningún presidente,
and we do not confer moral authority or executive authority,
por muy poderosa o influente que sea.
no matter how powerful they may be.
Agradecemos la solidaridad internacional y la necesitamos.
We are appreciative of international solidarity, and we accept it.
Respetamos mucho, incluso muchas personas que piensan que la política de Obama va a beneficiar a la causa de la libertad de Cuba.
We respect those who think that President Obama's policies will benefit Cuba.
Pero solo pedimos, por favor, que nos tengan en cuenta, que no se nos ignore.
But all that we ask, please, is that you recognize this and that you take this into account.
Berta.
Sí, es muy importante que sepan
It is very important for you to know.
el gobierno cubano
The Cuban
usa
government-
terrorismo de Estado
It is very important for you to
contra
know.
mujeres indefensas pacíficas.
It is very important for you to know that the Cuban government uses state terrorism against defenseless women.
El gobierno cubano
The Cuban government
no es un gobierno soberano,
is not a sovereign government.
no ha sido elegido.
The Cuban government has not been elected.
Por tanto, la
Therefore-
soberanía de Cuba somos nosotros los cubanos.
Therefore, we Cubans are the sovereignty of Cuba.
Y tenemos derecho a opinar.
We have the right to express our opinion.
Es muy importante
It is very
que
important
sepan
that you know
que no tenemos problema
we have no problem.
con los gobiernos de Estados Unidos,
We have no problem with the governments of the United States
porque siempre han tratado de apoyar al pueblo de Cuba.
because they have always tried to support the people of Cuba.
Lo que de la forma que se está haciendo estas negociaciones es lo que no estamos de acuerdo,
What we are against is the way in which these negotiations are being conducted
puesto la soberanía somos nosotros el pueblo de Cuba.
because we are the sovereignty of the people of Cuba.
El secretismo que hubo entre el listado de los presos que iban a liberar
The secrecy surrounding the list of political prisoners who were going to be released
fue una muestra más de engaño del gobierno cubano.
was another deceit of the Cuban government.
Ya 14 hombres estaban en las calles.
14 prisoners had already been released.
Pero además no fueron hombres libres como los 3 espías que el presidente Obama le entregó sin condiciones a Fidel Castro.
But these 14 were not free men like those 3 spies that President Obama unconditionally handed over to the Castro regime.
Estos hombres han salido con libertad condicional.
These political prisoners that were released by the Castro regime have been released on parole.
Es muy importante que nos tengan en cuenta
You must take this into account.
que nosotros podemos ayudar a cómo puede hablar, a cómo puede hacer el gobierno de Estados Unidos con el gobierno cubano.
We can help in how the U.S. government deals with the Cuban government.
Con los criminales no se hace negocio y si se hace es con condiciones.
You can't do business with criminals, and if you do, you must have conditions.
Ustedes pueden ver que Raúl Castro está condicionando, quiere mucho más, pero también el gobierno de Estados Unidos tiene que pedirle al gobierno cubano.
You can see how Raúl Castro himself is already setting conditions. But which are the conditions that we're demanding from the Cuban government?
Es posible, por querer ejercer libertad religiosa, se puede llevar a prisión, se puede golpear, se puede hacer simulacro de matar, de sacar pistola para matar a mujeres porque quieren salir a ejercer su libertad religiosa.
How can it be possible that so much violence is exerted against women simply because they're trying to practice their religious freedom?
Es posible querer caminar por las calles de nuestro país de una forma pacífica, no violenta, y un gobierno totalitario nos golpee, nos tire turbas paramilitares para que nos golpeen.
How can it be possible that you're peacefully walking on a sidewalk in your country and the regime hurls pro-government thugs, paramilitary thugs against you?
Es posible que nos voten en lugares alejados de la ciudad y que los policías nos den con una pistola en la mano y nos fracturen las muñecas.
How can it be possible that the police take us to faraway parts of the city and that they fracture our wrists with their pistol butts?
Es un pueblo sufrido.
It is a suffering people.
Es un pueblo que necesita libertad.
It is a people that needs freedom.
La libertad depende de nosotros los cubanos.
Freedom depends on us Cubans.
Pero queremos contar con el apoyo moral y espiritual de otros gobiernos.
But we need the support. We need the material and spiritual support of other governments.
Voy a ir más atrás.
I'm going to go further back.
En 1980.
In 1980.
100,000 cubanos se fueron de Cuba.
100,000 Cubans left Cuba.
Maestros.
Teachers.
Ingenieros.
Engineers.
Médicos.
Physicians.
En ese momento Fidel dijo que eran escoria, que se iban por problemas económicos.
Castro called them scum and said they were leaving due to economic
Berta,
reasons.
I'm going to interrupt you a second because I know that you've got a flight to catch. I just want to say something before you leave. This is the news of today. Dissidents arrested for protests near Cuban National Assembly. This morning, so much has changed. A group of 12 dissidents were arrested as they tried to stage a protest near the Havana headquarters of the Cuban regime's National Assembly. The dissidents, part of the Orlando Zapata Tamayo Civil Resistance Front, took out a sign demanding the elimination of Castro's draconian laws, that ever-wonderful social dangerousness, and the ratification of the UN human rights covenants. Their whereabouts remain unknown. In stark contrast, this release says, Cuban democracy activist Jorge Luis Garcia Perez Antunez and Sara Marta Fonseca, both leaders of this group, are freely and openly testifying before the U.S. House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. this morning. What a contrast. Berta, you've got to hop on a plane, and I know that you will be marching with the ladies in white on Sunday. We will pray for you. We will pray for all of the people of Cuba. You make us proud. You make freedom and liberty shine. Te deseamos lo mejor. Eres uno de nuestros orgullos. Te deseamos lo mejor en esa marcha, en el futuro de una Cuba libre, democrática y soberana.
Bueno, muchas gracias por la oportunidad que me han dado, ya que vengo de un país donde jamás voy a poder estar sentada frente al dictador Raúl Castro para decirle, fuera de Cuba, Cuba sí, Castro no.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Now move your butt over to the airport. Because that's free commerce in action. They won't hold that plane. Only in Castro's Cuba will they hold it. Muchas gracias, Berta. Te deseamos lo mejor. Sarah, and then I don't know if Mr. Thiel could speak as well. Sara, ¿quieres comentar?
Si me permiten, yo quisiera
If you allow me, I would like to
abordar el tema
speak
del sector privado,
about the private sector in Cuba.
porque consideramos que en Cuba no existe un sector privado,
There is no private sector in Cuba,
donde no hay libertad para negociar.
where there is no freedom to negotiate.
Los llamados cuentapropistas,
The so-called cuentapropistas or self-entrepreneurs,
que son una muy pequeña minoría,
who are a very tiny minority,
son chantajeados, manipulados por el régimen.
are constantly blackmailed and manipulated by the regime.
Tienen que responder a los intereses del régimen para poder mantener su pequeño negocio.
They must respond to the interests of the regime in order to keep their businesses running.
No pueden tener sus propios sindicatos,
They can't have their own unions.
no pueden defender sus derechos.
They can't defend their rights.
Por eso insisto en que ningún tipo de comercio con Cuba beneficia al pueblo.
That's why I insist. No type of commerce with Cuba benefits the people.
Lo que entra a Cuba se queda en las arcas y en las despensas del régimen.
Whatever enters Cuba remains in the hands of the regime. Whatever money enters Cuba remains in the hands of the regime.
También quiero decir
I also want to say
que yo siento una tristeza muy grande cada vez que pienso en cada preso político,
I feel a deep sadness every time I think of political prisoners.
porque es muy duro que en pleno siglo XXI
It is very hard that in the 21st century
en nuestro país existan presos por sus ideas.
that in the 21st century there are still people in my country who are imprisoned for their ideas.
Que hayan tantos niños y personas marginadas que no pueden terminar ni siquiera sus estudios por sus ideas.
That there are so many marginalized people who can't even finish their studies because of their ideas.
Pero no solamente esto.
But it's not only this.
Muchos jóvenes que no están directamente involucrados en los asuntos de la oposición
Many youth who are not directly involved in opposition activity
también sufren persecución y marginación por ser hijos de opositores.
also suffer from persecution and also suffer from discrimination because they are the children of opposition activists.
Es criminal que la juventud no pueda desarrollarse
It is a crime that youth cannot pursue their studies
y que desesperados busquen en la prostitución
and that they desperately seek in prostitution
para poder mantenerse y ayudar a su familia.
a means through which to maintain their families.
Condenamos enérgicamente al régimen de los Castro.
We condemn the Castro regime.
Basta ya, no queremos impunidad.
We demand that there be no impunity for the regime.
Necesitamos una patria libre,
We want
democrática y donde se respete la justicia.
a free, just, and democratic country.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I regret that I have a plane to catch as well. I did not give Mr. Thiel a chance to respond. I don't know if you'll be able to, and I'll hear it on CNN radio, C-SPAN radio.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm on Berta's flight. I just remembered. It's not going to wait for me either. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Thiel.
Only briefly, thank you. Thank you for the series of questions and comments. Without wanting to enter into a whole debate about exactly how you characterize the human rights situation in Cuba, which I don't think is particularly profitable, I think it's clear no one denies that there are serious human rights problems on the island. The question is how to address them and what the United States government can do. And I think that the policy of engagement that was announced on the 17th, the policy has been supported by others in the Cuban dissident community, some of whom testified before the Senate the other day, that's supported by the Catholic Church in Cuba, that's supported by the U.S. Catholic Conference, that was endorsed by the Pope, that a number of Republicans as well as Democrats in this Congress have endorsed, that Freedom House has endorsed. I think the message is there's a very strong view that the best way to address the human rights situation in Cuba is engagement. And I'll
Thank you, Mr. Thiel. Let me just, and I'll give, if any of you want to make any final comments as we conclude the hearing, I would again respectfully disagree with Mr. Thiel, and I thank you for your candor. We've tried that before, and it seems to me it's not about isolation. It is about meaningful engagement where steps that we take are predicated on just observing universally recognized human rights. We're only asking that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the treaties that have been enacted, or for want of a better word, with concurrence and full all-in by the countries of the world, be followed. And certainly the Convention Against Torture, which has been violated with impunity by Castro, and is one of the most egregious violations. Torturing people is one of the most heinous acts one human being can commit against another. I would just very quickly, Mr. Thiel, have you ever asked to meet with a political prisoner in prison? No? I hope you would. I think that, I think I have made it my business, 35 years as a member of Congress, to meet with dissidents everywhere and anywhere I go where there's a repressive regime, but I always seek to go to the prisons to try to show some solidarity, some empathy with those who are suffering the daily acts of torture and brutal mistreatment that Mr. Antunez articulated, and just, the book that got me into fighting for religious freedom, frankly, in 1981 was Tortured for Christ by Richard Wurmbrand, who talked about the Securitate, just like in the prisons of Cuba, where torture is commonplace. And then when I met Amanda Valadares' book, as I mentioned earlier, he talked about these tortures that just never ended. He even talked about Ho Chi Minh poles that would be jabbed in as people tried. There was no sleep. Talk about sleep deprivation, just no sleep. But you never know when you're going to get another shot in the face, the nose, the solar plexus, the groin area. As the guards shifted from one guard shift to another, they would use these Ho Chi Minh poles. And then some of the things that Mr. Antunez talked about, always designed by sadists to get extract the worst possible pain on women and men, and then, of course, the sexual abuses that are visited upon people as well. Dr. Bissett talked about how they punched his teeth, major problems, just beatings, and more beatings. I honestly believe Castro and those who have committed these atrocities ought to be held to account by the world for crimes against humanity, rather than invited in as partners. Yes, you've got to deal with dictators as a country. Ours does, as do many others. But to have human rights as, an issue, maybe an issue, not the issue, is a serious mistake. And again, the embargo, I would just say for the record, and perhaps some of our witnesses want to speak to this, there has been robust trade with the European Union, Canada, and other countries of the world with Cuba for decades. And there has been no diminution whatsoever in torture, child sex trafficking. If anything, the trade has facilitated, particularly with convicted pedophiles and others who travel the world to abuse little children, to rent a boy or a girl when they go to Cuba. I just had passed on the floor of the House of Representatives for the third time the International Megan's Law, so that convicted pedophiles, that we will notice countries of destination when they are leaving to go on sex tourism trips. How horrific is it that the government of Cuba actually benefits financially from that? And if that's not accurate, then allow a full-scale investigation, because we have so many stories and so much information. And again, I have to say this, and I would put this, major parts of this into the record. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act has established what we call the TIP report. Comes out every year, and Cuba, again, is been designated an egregious violator, a Tier 3 country when it comes to modern-day slavery. So the idea of trade, and somehow there will be a matriculation with more trade with the dictatorship towards democracy, didn't work in Vietnam. They have gotten worse, has not worked in China. Xi Jinping is in a love affair with Mao Zedong. He longs for the day of the Mao. And he's taking that country further down the road of torture as more trade occurs with the People's Republic of China. And even many of our businesses are learning that if you don't respect human rights, intellectual property rights and the like are another casualty of a dictatorship. And when people talk about the Internet being open, I'm the one who held the hearings right in this room several times, but one truly historic one with Google, Yahoo, Microsoft, and Cisco. And it was, yes, it was in China, swore them all in, and they were part of the censorship. And we know the Castro regime has great capabilities, as does Lukashenko in Belarus, as do other dictators, to ensure that that Internet and whether it be emails or anything else will be very closely surveilled so that more of the best and the bravest and the brightest of Cuba are found and apprehended and thrown into prisons. So there is no open Internet there. There isn't in any dictatorship anywhere in the world. China has literally written the book on how a dictatorship can control the Internet with the Great Firewall of China, and we have a situation that will replicate itself big time there. Finally, I would just say this testimony from these unbelievably brave women and men who have suffered at the hand of Castro helps tear off the veil of secrecy, an open secret, if you will. It's been out there, but thankfully through C-SPAN and the media that's here and the congressmen and women who will see this record, you are bearing truth and bearing witness to a very ugly reality that is pervasive. Again, I do believe the facade of legitimacy that Castro craves, and I believe just got a helping hand. And that's just not my view. The Washington Post and so many others have already opined on that in their editorials. This was not the time to take that view. There should have been an effort to say human rights first, as you said, Mr. Antunez, then economic issues and other kinds of engagements. But as we've seen, I've seen one statement after another come out of Havana from high government officials that nothing's going to change. And if anything, with the rearrests of at least 5, maybe more, of the 53, and others who have been rounded up, which is the game that this man plays, or this regime plays in Cuba, just shows that they are intent on doubling down and making it even worse for the dissidents. So thank you for again, bearing witness to the truth and for exposing these crimes against humanity. And if you'd like to make any final comment, Mr. Thale, starting with you and then finishing with Mr. Antunez.
Briefly, only to say, Congressman Smith, obviously I have the deepest respect for your commitment to human rights, and particularly your focus on child trafficking, human trafficking issues. Obviously, we differ about what's the best way to move forward in Cuba, and I'm happy to continue that discussion. The only very specific thing I'd say on the human trafficking issue is that if you look at the UN human trafficking reports on Cuba, they're different than our Tier 3 listing. They're different because Cuba and the United States, Cuba's refused to dialogue with the United States about this issue. I believe that that's changing, and there have been some discussions with the TIP unit. So.
Can I just say, you know, the problem has been with some UN bureaucracies. I remember I held a hearing in this room on Elian Gonzalez, and Reverend Walker came and presented testimony and was waxing eloquent about how the child mortality rate is so low. Mm-hmm. And I had read the reports that came out of certain UN agencies that suggested that that was so. And I asked him, because I know, one, as some of our witnesses have said earlier, or as Ileana Russ-Layton pointed out, trusting government officials to tender honest numbers. You know, if you believe that, I'll sell you the Brooklyn Bridge. It just, there's no reliability, there's no independent confirmation, there's no cross-checks or checks and balances whatsoever. But that said, I also pointed out that Dr. Bichette, an OBGYN, Afro-Cuban, a great man, who has suffered horribly for his views on human rights, belief in human rights, he exposed the eugenics policies in Cuba, where children who have disabilities are routinely killed through coercive abortion, so that, yeah, sure, some of these kids never make it to birth because they've been killed by the state. And that is another crime against humanity. It was called that at the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunals for what the Nazis did to the Polish women and others. It is no less a crime against humanity today. Dr. Bichette suffered for that. So those numbers are very, very unreliable. And about child mortality and the like. And as Ileana mentioned earlier, Ileana Ross-Layton, there's so much showcasing going on, but the ability to discern the real facts when others bear witness that that's not the case is very, very large. Ms. Fonseca?
Sí tengo algo que decir.
Yes, I have something to say.
Yo recuerdo en el año 1990.
I remember that in 1990.
No puedo dar una cifra exacta, no la tengo.
I don't have a precise amount. I don't have a precise number.
Mi hijo menor nació ese año solamente con 24 semanas de gestación. Fue prematuro.
My youngest son was born prematurely.
Y en el hospital donde él nació,
And where he was born,
yo vi morir varios niños.
I saw several children die.
Sin embargo, ese reporte sé que no fue dado ni siquiera nacionalmente ni internacionalmente. De eso Cuba nunca habló.
However, I know that the hospital never reported those deaths, and it was not known nationally or internationally.
Yo nunca me ha gustado escuchar los discursos de Fidel Castro, pero sé que era necesario escucharlo y muchas veces lo hice.
I didn't like to listen to Fidel Castro's speeches, but sometimes I had to, and I did.
Porque tenemos que conocer al enemigo.
Because we need to know what the enemy says.
Y Fidel Castro es el enemigo de Cuba.
And Fidel Castro is the enemy, and Fidel Castro is the enemy of Cuba.
Ese año yo escuché el discurso del dictador.
I listened to the dictator's speech that year.
Y él se refirió a la mortalidad infantil como muy baja. No recuerdo exactamente la cifra.
He said that, I don't know what the statistic was, but he referred to the child mortality rate in Cuba being very low.
Pero casualmente con la situación de mi embarazo y luego del nacimiento de mi hijo, yo había estado en 2 hospitales.
But having been pregnant and having had the difficult situation with my son, I had been in 2 hospitals.
Donde puedo asegurarles que hubo muchos más niños fallecidos.
And I can assure you that many more children had died.
Pero además,
But also,
yo nunca recibí la asistencia médica adecuada
I never received adequate medical assistance
para llevar a término mi embarazo.
In order to help me in childbirth.
En Cuba, la medicina, como la educación,
In Cuba, medicine and education
solamente es buena para quienes simpatizan con el régimen.
are only good for those who are part of the regime or who sympathize with the regime.
Ese es mi testimonio en cuanto a la mortalidad infantil
That is my testimony with regards to the child mortality rate in Cuba.
y en cuanto a los tratos que recibe un cubano que no está de acuerdo con el régimen, tanto en hospitales como en escuelas.
And as to what kind of treatment a Cuban who dissents from the regime receives in schools and hospitals.
Mr. Antunez.
Sí. Yo quería dejar algo bien sentado de concluir.
I want to clearly establish something before we finish today.
Y es que quizás no se haya comprendido bien.
Maybe it hasn't been well understood.
O la propia habilidad que tiene el régimen para dar ciertas cifras parece que a muchas veces confunde.
Or maybe it's the regime's ability to spew false statistics sometimes confuses people.
Quiero que sepan que a pesar de que hay algunas personas de la disidencia dentro de Cuba que apoyan la política de Obama para Cuba,
I want to tell you that in spite of the fact that there are some dissidents who do support Obama's policy towards
en este caso las negociaciones, por así decirlo,
in what I'm referring to are the negotiations.
Podemos decirle que son la minoría.
I can tell you that it's a minority of dissidents.
Le aseguro que la mayoría de los líderes de la oposición dentro de Cuba
I assure you that the majority of dissident leaders in Cuba, of opposition leaders in Cuba,
se oponen
oppose.
Y una prueba de ello es lo que forman el Foro por los Derechos y Libertades,
And an example of this is the Forum for Rights and Freedoms,
así como el Acuerdo por la Democracia en Cuba.
as well as the Agreement for Democracy in Cuba.
Ambas iniciativas
Both of these are initiatives,
son firmadas
have been signed,
y encabezadas por importantes líderes de la resistencia cubana.
have been signed by the most important leaders of the Cuban resistance.
Otra cosa que quiero pedirles a ustedes, porque sé que esta actividad o esta grabación va a formar parte de los récords del Congreso,
There's one last thing which I also want to tell you, because I know this is part of the permanent congressional record.
y es algo que desde que lo escuché me ha tornado bastante preocupado,
And it's something that has worried me ever since I first heard it,
porque sé que las víctimas de ellos no tienen esta voz o esta posibilidad de hablar por acá.
because I know that the victims don't have the possibility of speaking here.
Y le estoy pidiendo a los medios que me escuchan, que me ven,
I ask those who are seeing me and those who are listening to me,
a todas las personas de buena voluntad que están escuchando
all those who are well-intentioned are listening to
este
this,
evento, que por favor sigan de cerca
I ask you to closely follow
la situación represiva que está teniendo lugar en estos precisos momentos en Cuba,
the repressive situation in Cuba right now,
en torno a un grupo de organizaciones que forman el Frente Nacional de Resistencia Cívica Orlando Zapata,
I want to call attention to how the Cuban National Civic Resistance Front, which consists of different organizations, is being repressed.
que no ayer ni antier, sino ahora mismo,
Not yesterday or not the day before yesterday, but right now,
están siendo reprimidos
are being repressed
por pedir libertad y democracia.
because they're demanding freedom and democracy.
Finalmente decirle que
Finally,
la lucha por la causa de la libertad de Cuba
the struggle for Cuban freedom
ha costado tanto dolor,
has cost a lot of pain,
tanta sangre,
a lot of blood,
tantos muertos,
a lot of dead,
tanto presidio,
a lot of political prisoners.
para nosotros permitir
And that's why we can't allow
que una artera maniobra de Raúl Castro
that a maneuver by Raúl Castro
pueda llegar a un entendimiento con el gobierno de los Estados Unidos,
can result in an understanding with the U.S. government
que pueda contribuir a la oxigenación
that may contribute to oxygen being provided to this
y al
dictatorship,
continuismo del régimen.
and therefore to the continuity of the regime.
Les aseguro que un continuismo
I assure you
o un neocastrismo
that the permanency regime in power,
puede ser mucho más funesto
I assure you that neo-Castroism can be worse.
estos años que hemos llevado.
I assure you that neo-Castroism can be worse than all these years we've suffered.
Y darle las gracias a ustedes por esta oportunidad,
I want to thank you for this opportunity,
de manera especial al presidente Smith,
and especially Chairman Smith,
y que sepan que la resistencia cubana, a pesar de este pacto que consideramos alevoso e indigno,
and that the Cuban resistance, in spite of this agreement, which we consider to be immoral,
a pesar del dolor de los golpes, del encarcelamiento, de la represión,
in spite of the beatings, in spite of the imprisonment, in spite
la
of the pain,
resistencia cubana va a continuar su lucha.
the Cuban resistance will continue its struggle.
No vamos a confiarle el destino de nuestro país o de nuestra patria a nadie.
We are not going to surrender our country's destiny to anyone,
Porque estamos convencidos que los principios
because we are convinced
y el destino de una nación
that the principles and the destiny of a country
no puede decidirse en una mesa,
should not be decided on a negotiating table.
en una negociación de espaldas al pueblo.
The destiny and the freedom of a country should not be decided at a negotiating table where the people have been excluded from.
Muchas gracias. Le digo al mundo, le digo al Congreso, le digo a los hermanos de Cuba que me están escuchando,
I thank the U.S. Congress. I thank those in Cuba who are listening to us.
que después de esta experiencia regreso a Cuba
And I return to Cuba after this experience.
mucho más convencido del camino que hemos trazado
I return to Cuba after this experience much more convinced of the path that we have taken.
y más firme, incólume y me consigna de que ni me callo ni me voy de Cuba. Muchas gracias. Viva Cuba Libre.
And I reiterate what is my slogan: I will not leave and I will not be quiet. Long live free Cuba.
Thank you so very much for that eloquence and courage. Thank you all for your testimonies and leadership. The hearing is adjourned.
Tonight on C-SPAN